I tell you right up front, I'm not really a train guy. Okay, when I was 3 years old, I thought they were the coolest things ever, and I'm in favor of wide-scale improvements to the United States rail network so that high-speed passenger service is viable. But I don't have a model train set. I don't go out and watch trains go by. I've never been to Miniature Wunderland, although now that I think about it, I am planning on going to Germany in the next year or so. My point is, trains aren't really my thing. What is my thing is exploring games as a whole cultural concept. I don't just want to see what's popular, I want to find the conceptual boundaries being pushed. And as a large part of that, I import, collect, and document a whole lot of obscure games from Japan. In fact, what I usually do on this channel is document the game libraries of Japanese systems. That exploration, going, what is this? And then, well, I have to try it, is what led me to a Japanese game series called Densha de Go. You might have heard of it, even though no games in the series have ever been released outside of Japan. The series was a favorite whipping boy for a while, by people who would go, look at this game, isn't it weird? Though virtually all of them would go on to say, and it's actually good. Densha de Go is an enormous series that was a wild success in Japan. Absolutely huge. And it's all about driving trains. Obviously, I had no idea how you turned that into a hit arcade game, so I specifically sought out Densha de Go and found something I really enjoyed. That led me to Densha de Go's rival train game series, Train Simulator. I started specifically importing these games, and I built up a small library of train games. While it wasn't a popular theme for video games, there are a lot more train games out there than you might think. And because they tend to fly under the radar, I started thinking, maybe someone should show off the genre. Tell people that these games exist and that they're worth checking out. And that's where this video comes from. This video is going to go over roughly 50 games. It's not every single train game out there. Like I said, there's more of them than you think. A lot of series wind up feeling pretty much the same among multiple entries, and there's some games that are specifically for train enthusiasts that are just in my blind spot. So if there's a train game that you happen to like that I don't touch on, well, that's what comment sections are for. I might even give it a try. Obviously, this video is going to have a lot of focus on Densha de Go. It's the biggest train game series. It spawned a whole family of imitators and people trying to cash in. And some of those imitators came from Densha de Go's own creators at Taito. So I'm going to use that series as a jumping off point. But before I even get there, there is one important question that has to be answered. First things first, a train game is not just a game about trains. In Railroad Tycoon, you build a transportation network using trains to haul goods back and forth. There are a lot of train strategy games like this out there. In fact, that kind of strategy game predates computers, and that style of game is a huge board game genre. Now, I could talk about 1830 and its descendants, or the Crayon Rail series, for a very long time. But it's not the subject of this video. A train game is not a game that is set on a train. There are a lot of adventure games, like The Last Express, that confine themselves to a train. But that doesn't make them train games. They're games that are set on trains. The key thing about train games is that you're driving a train. That doesn't just mean any game where you drive a train. In Donkey Kong Country, you drive entire stages in a minecart on rails. But in that game, trains aren't the central feature. 99% of your time is doing something else. Okay, more like 90% of the time in Donkey Kong Country, but that's because the minecart levels are hard and you'll have to replay them a lot. The point is, for the purposes of this video, a train game is a game where the primary action of the game is driving a train. Now, if you disagree with that definition or want to pull in some other things, that's fine, I'm not the genre police, you do you. This is so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm not just going to stick to train games, though. People have taken the concepts that were developed in train games and taken them elsewhere. So I'll also eventually touch on things like driving other forms of mass transit, or games about driving vehicles where you have very limited control inputs. Train games got the ball rolling in a few different places, and it's going to be worth pointing out where they wound up. So with that said, and expectations set, let's go back to the very beginning. Densha de Go might have been the flashpoint for train games as a genre, but that doesn't mean that it was the first train game. Before 1997, there were several other people who made games based on trains, and for the most part, these didn't have a whole lot of impact. They didn't have that magic spark that caught people's attention. But it's still worth looking at them because we're going to see echoes of these games after the genre pulls out of the station. The earliest train game I could find was Sega's Super Locomotive, a 1982 game where you are definitely there to drive that train. As you might expect from an arcade game, it's very action-driven. It's also brutally difficult. Part of the challenge is that you really have to split your focus between the top and bottom of the screen. Up top, you can see the current railway ahead of you, the switches, if the line is closed, and if any other locomotives are trying to ram you. While at the bottom, you can see the attacks from the air, and it shows you how you're fighting back. Up top has your relative position, so you hit right to go faster, left to go slower, or reverse if you find that handy. And up and down will control if you switch tracks. On that upper screen you can easily see the other trains that are trying to ram you, or the signals that you'll crash into if you go that way. When they're red you'll ram into them, and when they're blue you can pass through and flip them to red, causing everyone else to crash. Up there you'll know the best time to activate your super mode, which costs some of your oil, makes you go faster, and makes you invulnerable for about 5 seconds. That oil is your primary resource, it's constantly draining away, and you use it both for super mode and to attack. So you also have to keep an eye out for refueling stations where you can pick up more oil. For such a simple game concept, this is weirdly complicated. And I haven't even got into the aerial attacks yet. You can see the planes and blimps and missiles and bombs approaching you on the top screen, but to really deal with them you have to look at the bottom. That's because your attack emerges from your smokestack and rises into the air as long as you're holding down the button, and then when you release the button it flies backward. So you have to aim your shots down there to take out incoming attacks. Eventually you'll pull into the station and there will be a little bonus game, but then you repeat the process on an even harder stage. Super Locomotive is constantly throwing tons of things at you, and you're just gonna have to try to juggle all of them. But I also thought the sheer number of systems that you had to manage made it kind of exciting. We'll see a few more games that merge action and train driving, but no one else goes quite so many places as Super Locomotive. Trains is a fairly obscure game. It's one of only 2 games by its developer, Interactive Picture Systems, and its publisher, Spinnaker, barely survived past the 80s. Even among fans of old computer games, there's no one championing it, or even really looking down on it. Trains is an example of the perfectly average, generic, early 80s computer game. So why am I including it in this video? Well, first of all, it's a video about train games, and the game's title is Trains. I'd feel weird if I didn't include it. But also, Trains is here acting as the stand-in for a couple of different early train game concepts. Trains plays a bit like an arcade game, though not really one that's out to munch your quarters. Your goal is to survive 8 rounds of train driving, and the layout of each stage has some loops and switches. Basically, it looks like a model train layout. And that's something that came up a few times in these very early train games. Someone wanted to put their model train on a computer and drive it. Okay, that's what we have here. You have to survive a certain amount of time before the tracks to the next map are built, and at regular intervals you'll have money deducted from you for payroll, and if that or your coal runs out, then it's game over. You make money by driving your train to different industries, picking up inputs like logs and ore, and dropping it off at places that can use those, like sawmills and refineries. Different cars on your train can take different kinds of loads, so you have to pull your train up to the appropriate spot and then hit the fire button on the controller in order to load or unload that car. Places can't produce or use unlimited quantities though, so you'll often have to take or drop off what you can get. This is very reminiscent of the other style of railroad game, the ones that I'm not talking about in this video, and these are typically strategy games where your goal is to build a transportation network, getting goods between appropriate locations. I'm afraid that this train winds up being pretty simple. As the stages go on and you have to deal with more of a variety of cars, well, it's still easy because you just move up and back off your cars. One look at the maps and you can tell what routes you should be taking, and then you just drive those same circles until the path to the next region opens. It's not the worst thing ever, but there's a reason that Trains is a completely forgotten game. Now we head all the way over to the UK, and there in 1986 was the first train simulator, or at least the first train simulator I could find. Southern Belle simulates a train in the 1930s running between Victoria Station in London and Brighton. I don't have any audio playing for this one because the only sound for this game is a repetitive burst of noise every couple of seconds that I think is supposed to be the steam engine operating, but it really makes it annoying to hear anything. I'm playing the Commodore 64 version, and yes, those are polygonal 3D graphics, running at about 1 frame per second. And I think that's my cue to give a little bit of explanation on the environment that Southern Belle was released into. Southern Belle was the creation of a 2-man team who only made Southern Belle and its sequel Evening Star, which is the exact same game, just with a different train line. So I'm not going to be showing that one off. In the mid-80s, in the UK, there were a lot of people who tried their hand at making games, just programming them out of their bedroom, and then distributing them cheap on cassette and floppy. What this resulted in was an explosion of unusual ideas that often wound up struggling. My point is, Southern Belle was likely made by 2 guys who had a computer and some spare time, and they built it to the standard of simulators of the day. Not train simulators, because they were really the first ones to do this, but more flight simulators and the occasional driving simulator. Southern Belle gives you a lot of different options for how realistic you want it to be. You're driving a steam engine here, so if you want it to be realistic, there's a lot of functions you have to juggle. Getting the boiler up to pressure, maintaining the water, stoking the fire, and regulating just enough pressure to keep the train moving, while not letting the whole thing come to a halt. And you can choose how much of that you want to be automated. I didn't really feel like learning a 1986 simulator, so I'm just playing with the absolute basic values, and I'm using the easiest mission, which is just get to the end of the line as fast as you can. So all I had to do was crank the train up to speed and let it run. But if you wanted to manage everything, well, you can. Of course, this is a game that's more historically interesting than something you'd want to go back to and play. Look at what 2 guys working in their bedroom on an underpowered computer in 1986 could make. It's impressive in that sense, but probably not really rewarding compared to a lot of the other train games we're going to see. The train Escape to Normandy is unique among these early games I'm going to talk about, because it's the one that you can go out and buy right now. It's on Steam for $7. I have to say, I appreciate the person who tagged it on Rails Shooter. The train Escape to Normandy has quite a pedigree. The publisher was Accolade, who at the time were making a real name for themselves with simulation games for the PC. Things like Ace of Aces and Test Drive. And the developer of the PC version was Dynamics, a name that just made everyone who played computer games in the 90s go, "Oh," and everyone else go, "Who?" Dynamics would spend the next 10 years making a bunch of games on the cutting edge of technology. Many of the most relevant ones to this discussion are the Red Baron series and the MechWarrior series. The train Escape to Normandy has you play as an American commando dropped into France just prior to the D-Day landings. The Germans have a superweapon, a train with a lot of artillery guns on it, and your goal is to steal it and use it to support the landings. There are a lot of scenes like this in the train, where it's just a shooting gallery. In fact, the game starts like this, where you're trying to cover a French resistance fighter who's stealing the key. Then after you select your difficulty, which determines which route you'll be taking, then you actually get to drive the train. They do a decent job of giving you all the controls. It's a steam train, so you have to worry about pressure, the temperature of the fire, how much coal and water you have, and you've got control of the brakes, throttle, fire, and steam release. While you're chugging along, there's points that you have to stop. You can't cross bridges because the Germans are waiting there, and they'll blow up the bridge if you don't stop and take them out first. You can just zip through stations, but if you stop and take out the Germans there, then you can restock your coal and water, as well as communicate directions to the French resistance. You also have some control over your route, since when you approach a junction, you can use the train whistle to signal the resistance, and they can switch tracks for you. It seems like they felt driving a train was not enough for you, and so sometimes the train will come under attack from the Luftwaffe, and you'll have to switch to the train's mounted guns in order to take them out. Something you'll notice while playing the train escape to Normandy is that it is very time compressed. Kilometers will fly by as though you're driving the TGV rather than a steam engine. You also brake way faster than you might expect. While there's no call for precision, you do have to stop for stations and bridges when there's 0 kilometers left. The scenery also isn't much to look at. Even when you're passing landmarks like bridges and stations, you just have generic terrain outside your window. All this makes the train feel like a bit of a mixed bag. It has a decent and accessible set of controls for driving the train, but the shooting sections don't control especially well. I have to use the terrible IBM PC joystick here, rather than a mouse to aim. And the train doesn't really handle like a train. I really like the interactions with the French resistance, and plotting a route so that you can steal a train is a really great idea. The problems are, the train has got 1 foot in action and 1 foot in simulation, and it doesn't manage to do either of them extremely well. The games I talked about before were all experiments that really didn't go anywhere. Southern Belle was the only one that got a sequel, but its sequel is even more obscure than it is. Train Simulator JR East Chuuou Line 201 series is the first train simulator that I would consider to be successful. Even before it was released, additional games were planned, and each of those covered a new train line. So just 1 month after this, there were 2 more train simulator releases, one for the Tokaido main line, one for the Tohoku main line, and they just kept coming. I'm going to be coming back to the developer Ongakan a lot in this video. While Taito's Densha de Go might have been the superstar of the train game genre, Ongakan is going to be quietly plugging away in the background, making train simulator after train simulator. They've made dozens of these games, but I'll be coming back to them when they make the jump to console. These early versions of Train Simulator for the PC have enough rough edges that I'd rather focus on the console versions. For example, as a Japanese PC game from 1995, it only runs in 640 by 480 resolution. I'm playing the Windows version here, though a DOS version exists, and if you can somehow find it, that one's probably going to be an easier time. Something that you'll notice if you're familiar with Densha de Go is that Train Simulator is suspiciously close to Taito's arcade game. And if you're not familiar with Densha de Go, well, give me about 5 minutes and we'll get to it. I couldn't find anyone saying anything definitive, but the original version of Train Simulator was released right around the same time when Taito would have started development on Densha de Go. The Train Simulator series started coming out in the fall of 1995, and the early revisions of Densha de Go reached arcades at the end of 1996. It's easy to imagine that someone at Taito played Train Simulator, went, I love this, how do I turn it into an arcade game? And then the rest was history. Every Train Simulator release is just one train line, and there's an obvious reason for that. While the train's control panel and the game's interface use pre-rendered 3D graphics, The view from the train is a video. The entire train line recorded in one 270 megabyte AVI file. It's a 22-minute long, 308 by 154, 15 FPS video. Now if you're going, why is such a puny video 270 megabytes? Well, it's 1995. Video compression is not a trivial problem, and it's CPU expensive. This is video that had to be decoded and displayed on a processor running at 1/30th of the speed of the chip that you're watching this on. And it didn't have the advantage of multiple cores, separate graphics chips, or the past 30 years of computer scientists and mathematicians focused on ways to more efficiently handle data. My point is, you only got one line because they only had room on the CD for one line. Okay, really, if they wanted to put in a lot of extra work, they probably could have fit on a second line, but I'm not going to hold it against Gatan for not wanting to do that. The video is part of the key selling point of Train Simulator. You're getting the real cockpit view, and you've got real train sounds, real station sounds, real traffic sounds. And of course, all of it's recorded on board the actual train that you're going to be driving. You'd play Train Simulator if you wanted verisimilitude. The way that Train Simulator works is that it's broken up as levels, but the levels aren't really levels. At level 1, you just drive the first stop on the line. At level 2, you drive a few more stops, and on and on. You also have to deal with more complicated signaling as you get further in levels. You might have to reduce speed in certain areas, but really the key difference is how much of the line you drive. There are 2 modes for every level, drive and test. The two are effectively identical, it's just that test is a little bit more stringent on the requirements. And if you complete the test, then you unlock the next level. On the right hand side you'll see your timetable. Any relevant signals will appear on the left, and while the gauges work, you'll probably want to read your speed digitally at the top of the screen. The controls are extremely simple. You use up and down arrows to adjust your speed and brake. You can't have both on at the same time. Most of the rest of the keys on the keyboard will blow your horn, but the N key adjusts the forward-reverse lever. So if you overshoot a station by a little bit, you can put the train in reverse and back up to it. Your goals are to get to each station on time, and then stop at your exact mark. And that mark has a plus or minus 5 meter buffer. The only way to get a game over here is to overshoot the station by an enormous amount. Basically the length of an entire car. Otherwise it'll just let you keep going. There's no scoring, you don't get bonuses for precision, you don't lose points for being late or having to accelerate in the station. Really, your goals are to drive the train, make all of the appropriate stops, and be close enough to on time that you pass your test. Gatan released over a dozen games using this exact engine, and they were distributed in a very bare-bones, minimalistic package. I think now is a good time to mention that we're going to be seeing a lot of the same train lines throughout this video. The Chuuou line that I was driving in this game is the main east-west trunk line in Tokyo. That makes it one of the busiest train lines in the world, though not the busiest in Tokyo. Train Simulator provided the template for a lot of other train games in the late 90s, games that also used recorded train footage and followed a lot of the same mechanics. Unfortunately, it's a bit harder to get your hands on those, but since they are nearly identical to Train Simulator, I am just going to move on. When I was originally planning this video, I was going to completely skip over Densha de Go. I was thinking everybody already talks about it and knows all about Densha de Go, but nobody talks about all of the games that were responses to it. That's a pack of games that's gone almost completely unnoticed outside of Japan. I like talking about the obscure stuff that nobody knows, not the popular things that have been covered everywhere. But then as I got further into my preparations, I realized I couldn't avoid it. Densha de Go informs how every other train game behaves. And while I was pretty confident that the audience I was targeting would know Densha de Go, it wasn't a good idea to just assume familiarity. Especially since there's less information out there in English than I thought. The arcade version of Densha de Go got an absolutely huge response when it began location testing in 1996. So huge that the game was actually a bit of a phenomenon even before it was widely available. The game was made more widely available in early 1997, and then for about the next 10 years, Densha de Go was a mainstay in Japanese gaming. I'm playing the PlayStation port here, which is nearly identical to the arcade game. It's just lower resolution and has less draw distance. The obvious question that comes up about Densha de Go is, why did it catch on? Why did this game become one of Japan's biggest video game hits of the late 90s? I think there's three primary reasons. The one that most people seem to reach to is, well, Japan just likes trains. And I think that's a bit reductivist. A lot of places like trains, but you didn't see smash hit train games coming out of the UK. Still, there is something to be said for the game's concept being tied to something that was a daily fact of life for a huge portion of the Japanese population. Familiarity with a concept helps bridge that initial reluctance. So yes, the fact that there are trains everywhere, and that in Densha de Go you can drive those exact same lines and see scenery that you're familiar with, definitely helped it get attention in Japan. The concept of a game where you drive a train was novel to most people. It seems likely that Train Simulator provided an inspiration for Densha de Go, but computer games were a tiny, tiny niche in Japan in the mid-90s, so most people would have never seen or heard of it. So a person encountering Densha de Go would say, I get to drive the trains that I ride on every day? I have to try that. But I think the bigger factor, and the one that people overlook, is that Densha de Go was an arcade game. That might not sound like a very big deal in this era where the only arcades that are hanging on exist mainly for nostalgia. But there's an entire set of design philosophies that arcade games adhere to that can be easy to overlook. First, arcade games have to get your attention. If you're walking past an arcade machine, it has to entice those coins out of your pocket and into its money slot. Approaches toward this varied a lot over the lifespan of the arcades, and in the late 90s, one of the key ways to do this was an enormous, elaborate cabinet. And Densha de Go had one of the more spectacular presentations of an arcade machine at the time. There were two variations, one that was enclosed and with a much bigger screen, but they operated on the same principles, recreating the experience of being in the driver's seat of a train. There was a control panel with separate accelerator and brake levers, and these clicked into place as you moved them. There were also working indicators to tell you the speed that you were traveling at, and lights beside the screen replicating railway indicators, warning you of track conditions ahead. In the fancier version, the seat had a rumble function, replicating that track feel. In the arcade, Densha de Go promised you an experience. That's the kind of thing that will get someone to sit down and try it. Of course, getting someone to put money in the machine only takes you so far. Arcade games have to be accessible. Someone has to be able to sit down and intuitively understand the game enough to get 3 minutes of fun out of it. And that's really Densha de Go's biggest strength. It might have felt familiar, it might have been attention-grabbing, but no one's going to stick around unless they can play it. And Densha de Go can be stripped down to two very simple concepts. Make the train go fast so you can get to the next station on time, and then stop the train exactly at the end of the platform. Two goals, both obvious and intuitive, and a control scheme that consisted of go fast and stop. Now there is more to the game than that. Even in this first iteration it's more complicated. But the basic principles behind the game are that simple. Taito found the gameplay in driving a train by identifying the thing that everyone wants out of their trains: precision. You want that train to be on time. Now because Densha de Go is an arcade game, and arcade games have an ideal turnover of about 2.5 minutes per credit, Taito designed the game so that you would fail at that first stop. Not in a malicious way, it's just that anyone who's playing for the first time is probably going to overrun the station, by a lot. You have to learn how the trains behave to do well in Densha de Go. How smoothly they accelerate, how quickly they brake. In the footage that you're watching here, I'm screaming into the station, and then smoothly coming to a stop right on the mark. But I've also played a lot of Densha de Go, and spent a little bit of time before this footage getting the feel back. This is a game that's harder than it looks, but not in a way that makes people give up in anger. It's harder than it looks, but you also think that if you try again, maybe you can get it right that time. The next time you play, you'll know that that signal's coming up. You'll know that you need to crank the brakes up to 8 when it's at this point. That you need to let off the brake here and coast into that final stop. You know that you can do better, so why not give it one more try? It was a recipe for the biggest arcade hit of 1997. And then Taito brought it home. There are a lot of Densha de Go games. And even when versions for separate consoles are the same game, there are going to be some pretty significant differences. Fortunately, most of that settles down by the time we hit the PlayStation 2. But I have to start with this PlayStation game. If there's one thing that has gotten Densha de Go noticed outside of Japan, it's the specialty controllers. The arcade game gave you a whole cabinet, and if you wanted to play Densha de Go at home, you could do it with your standard controller, or you could buy a controller that replicated train controls. Taito made a lot of variations on the Densha de Go controller. The most common one that you'll find, and the one that's probably what most people want, is the two-lever design. Just like the arcade game, the left-hand lever is for acceleration, the right-hand lever is for brake, and you've got the rest of the buttons for your interface, plus sounding the horn. The controller even has a little spot to put your pocket watch. Perfect for keeping time on the railway. They made a version of this controller for the PlayStation, the Saturn, the Nintendo 64, the Dreamcast, and PCs. On top of that, if you didn't like it in black, you could have gotten it in a smoky translucent, atomic purple, or gold. If you were going to pick up a Densha de Go controller, this is the style I'd recommend because it works across the largest number of games. And the PlayStation version works on the PlayStation 2 as well. But maybe that's a bit old-fashioned for you. You want a controller that replicates a high-speed train design. Well, that would be the one-lever controller. Brake and acceleration is on the same stick. This one was only made for the PlayStation. Another variation that was only made for the PlayStation was streamlining the whole control scheme down to just a PlayStation controller. Again, you have separate accelerator and brake levers. It's just the accelerator is where the thumb pad would be, and the brakes are where the buttons would be. There are 2 more styles of controllers, but those are game-specific, so I'm going to hold off a bit before I get to them. When you put your Densha de Go disc into your PlayStation, you're given the choice of 4 train lines. The Sannin line, Keihin Tohoku line, Tokaido line, and the Yamanote line. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through every single train line that you can drive in these games, but the same train lines come up in these games over and over again, and in some of the games, some of these real-world lines have a special feature that's worth talking about. Like the Yamanote line, which often trades off the title of busiest train line in the world. It's the loop line that goes around Tokyo. That makes it the main train line for one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, and so the Yamanote line is very overrepresented in these games. When it comes to Japanese train games that offer a real-world experience, the ones that don't have the Yamanote line are the weird outliers. The Sannin line in Densha de Go is the tutorial level. It's a scenic railway, and some sections of it have a lot of tunnels and bridges. Basically, it's the choice to play if you don't want to drive through a city. And the times and stations are a lot easier to deal with than they are on the other stages. The way that Densha de Go works is that you're given 30 seconds at the top of the screen. Those really aren't seconds. You can treat them as health or points. When you do something wrong, points are taken away. If it reaches 0, then it's game over. But if you drive really well, or do something special, then you get additional points. If you do get a game over, then you can continue, but it takes you back to the last station you departed from, so you have to drive that leg all over again. Things that can lose you points while driving is exceeding the speed limit. Sometimes you'll see a yellow signal pop up, and that will tell you how fast you're allowed to go when you pass the next signal. You'll have to pay attention for other signals to clear the speed limit. One of the train lines has active track control, which means if you exceed the speed limit there, then the train is automatically stopped. That would be very bad if you encounter that, both for the points and for your time. You'll also see signs indicating changes in the track grade, that is whether you're going uphill or downhill, and that affects how the train accelerates and decelerates. The other important signal to watch out for is the yellow X, which indicates that you're entering a dangerous area and should sound the horn. Do so when you get a few more points. Fail to do so when you lose points. You can also use the horn to signal to workers, but if you just play around with the horn, then you wind up getting a penalty. And of course, the real challenge is coming to a stop in the station. Once you've fully pulled in, you're assessed, and then any bonuses or penalties are applied to that. Parking a train within 1 meter of the exact stopping location, and up to 3 seconds early on arrival, will get you bonus points. Everything else is a penalty. If you slowed down too much and had to accelerate in order to reach the stopping point, then that's a pretty big penalty. You also lose 2 points for every meter that you're over the stop point, and if you completely blast through the station, well then the game will automatically stop you and just give you a game over there. Once you get a game over or reach the end of the line, you'll get a scorecard assessing how well you did on that entire run, and that will give you the final score that goes on the board. If you're doing well, then you might have to deal with inclement weather, which affects how the train behaves, and there might be more complicated signaling for you to deal with. A line that's wide open and requires you to do 90 kilometers per hour might suddenly require that you slam on the brakes, and that can wind up being its own challenge. The PlayStation version has plenty of options to adjust difficulty. There's an actual difficulty setting, which changes how much precision you have to drive with, as well as how much time you have. But you can also do things like change the speedometer layout to something a little bit less useful, or hide the distance to the station. Basically, you can change the game up to be a bit more like an actual simulator. Though in this game, it really only earns you bragging rights. Since Densha de Go did so well, Taito naturally expanded on it. Densha de Go EX expanded the existing lines, as well as added a couple of additional ones. But to access those in the arcade, you had to enter secret codes with the controller. You had to move the brake and accelerator to certain positions, and then start the game. For the home port, which was only released for the Saturn, the additional lines are immediately accessible. Now, despite the fact that the Saturn version has 2 extra lines, it is a very, very bad port. For the sake of your own sanity, stick to the PlayStation version. Obviously, a hit meant a sequel.
2.
And 2 years later, there was Densha de Go Tsuukin-hen. Tsuukin-hen essentially means Express Edition. That tells you the focus of this sequel: high-speed express trains. Another big addition to the game is an indicator of how difficult each line is to drive, and variations for each line, so you could replay a line that you know with more difficult conditions. Naturally, home ports followed, and I've been playing the PlayStation version here, but now we start getting a little bit confusing with the ports. The PlayStation version added a few local lines to the mix, and so it dropped that express train subtitle. There's also a PC port that is just a straight arcade port. But then Taito offered an updated version of the arcade game, Densha de Go 2 Kousoken 3000, and the 3000 version was the basis of ports for the Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. Neither of those ports had the local lines, but the Nintendo 64 port added its own secret line that you could only access by doing well on all of the other lines. On top of that, the Nintendo 64 port is special because it's the Densha de Go game that has voice control. Yes, really. You'll have to have the Japanese Nintendo 64 microphone in order to get it to work. Your US Hey You Pikachu mic is not compatible. And you can use the mic to play a special conductor mode. It's really intended for 2 players, with one player driving the train, while the other player does the conductor duties. That means announcing the station, the departure, and controlling the train's doors. You need to make sure that people get out on the side that has a platform. If you want to know which version of Densha de Go 2 to play, the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 versions are both good, so it comes down to basically preference for features. You could get both, play the Nintendo 64 version until you unlock its special line, and then just drive the 2 local lines on the PlayStation version. Densha de Go 2 is the first game in the series to let you drive the Shinkansen, the bullet train. And I say that, but it's not the good Shinkansen. Not the one you're thinking of that connects Tokyo and Osaka in 2 hours. This is one of the slower Shinkansen lines, where you're really limited to about 140 kilometers per hour. Besides, that high-speed Shinkansen wouldn't work great in a game. You'd have to drive for 10 or 15 minutes with no interaction before you got to a station, and that would be awfully boring. The biggest difference between Densha de Go 1 and 2 is that 2 has a lot of lines where you have to drive through a station rather than stop at it. If you pass through these stations exactly on schedule, then you'll get bonus points. And if you're late, then points will start ticking away, just like they would at any other station. But beyond that, this is really the same game. Taito had a formula that worked, and they were sticking with it. And now the Densha de Go series takes a bit of a swerve. It's time for the first version that did not originate in the arcade. Densha de Go Professional Shiyou, or Professional Version. Free from the constraints of having to design a game acceptable for arcade operators, who ideally need to turn over customers every 3 minutes, Taito goes a bit mad. Densha de Go Professional is basically, what if we shoved all of the versions of Densha de Go together, and then piled on even more? Every single train line that has been represented in any Densha de Go game is present here. And there's very little in the way of new lines. However, there's nearly 100 different trains that you can drive. And the driving models for them are a lot more dynamic. When you're selecting a stage, you've got a list of 10 different routes that you can drive, and then every route has a set of timetables, which are actually separate stages. There's around 50 stages available immediately. And these stages aren't just repeating the same station. You can immediately see that there's different weather, different driving conditions, and for some routes, you can drive them backwards. I don't mean drive the train in reverse, I mean you can travel in both directions. There's even different time periods. If you drive a train from the 60s, you get a view of the terrain from the 60s. Though I did notice that the old trains seem to share the tracks with new ones. There are a lot of interface changes here. The biggest is that on modern trains, you've got an indicator of what's coming up on the track. Okay, it still doesn't help you when you have to slow down from 100 kilometers an hour to 45, but it is a lot easier to respond now. Certain special trains just have panel indicators telling you what your maximum speed is. And on that subject, we finally have our proper Shinkansen. You can get up to 240 easily before it starts making you brake for the station. And on that train, they have to use the indicators to tell you when to brake, because it takes a long time to get it up to speed and a long time to stop. And it's a long enough train that you'll have to enter the station at 70 kilometers an hour. Another change for Professional is that passengers now react to sudden braking. If you just flick the switch from 0 to 8, people will be annoyed, though this only results in a point deduction when you do it in the station. Densha de Go Professional is a lot more generous with the points, particularly on the less difficult lines. It starts you a lot higher and tends to award a lot more points. So despite the title, this version of Densha de Go is a lot more accessible for players. Now, if you didn't want to have to run all of those lines to unlock additional stages and trains, there was another option. Densha de Go Professional supports the Pocket Station, the tiny handheld LCD screen device that worked as a memory card, but you could also install software to it. And I'm just taking a note down here to do an entire video on all of the Pocket Station software. We'll see if I get to that in a couple of years. The Pocket Station game is just called Den Go, and it's a Densha de Go game that has been so stripped down that all you can do is accelerate and come to a stop. But clearing the lines here will also unlock them in the game, so this can be an easier way to get past some of those hard stages. The final Densha de Go game released for the original PlayStation was Densha de Go Nagoya Tetsudou-hen, or Nagoya Railway Edition. It's a step back from Professional, since it doesn't have nearly the quantity of trains and lines to drive. But there are 4 whole new lines, and rather than coming from the public Japan rail system, they're selected from a set of private railways. This game also brings in a few new styles of vehicles. One of the lines is a streetcar that transitions from operating on standard rail lines to driving in traffic. When you're driving in traffic, you have to obey traffic signals, but the vehicle is so light that you really aren't going to have too much trouble stopping. There's also a monorail that you drive around a zoo. Sadly, no animals are visible while driving the monorail. This is also the only time in the Densha de Go series where you get to drive a monorail, though as you might expect for such a system, the line is extremely short. An addition that makes this game a lot more accessible to those who just want to goof around is a mode that just lets you drive without any concern for speed limits, timetables, or points. You just drive the line and see what you find. Otherwise, the game plays pretty much identically to Densha de Go Professional. All of the improvements that came with that one are carried over here. The changes that are easily spotted occur on the trolley line, where you might have to deal with cars turning in front of you, emergency vehicles that require that you stop, and then there are the traffic lights that you have to obey. The timetable doesn't seem to take those traffic lights into account, so if you get stuck at a particularly long one, then it's game over. An odd feature of Nagoya Tetsudou-hen is a series of train-based minigames. However, all of these were designed to be played only with the one-stick controller, and I'm afraid that's a Densha de Go controller that I don't have. Breaking in here because this video production has gone on so long that I did get the one-handle train controller. None of the mini-games here actually have anything to do with trains, but they are following a trend that the main Densha de Go was part of. In the late 90s, as the arcades were losing their luster, one of the more common ways to push back against it was with arcade games that had unique control schemes. Your customers might be able to play fighting games at home, but could they drive a train, play a guitar, pedal a prop plane? Basically, the idea was to make arcade games more experiential. One of the approaches to this was to give you a special controller, and then a giant pile of mini-games that used that controller in different ways. Good examples of this are Namco's Point Blank series and Konami's Bishi Bashi. And of course, despite being designed around an arcade experience, a lot of these games got ported to home consoles, complete with elaborate peripherals. And I could do a whole video this length just on those ports, games inspired by them, and the mountains of weird peripherals that were involved. But I've got enough on my plate right now. This is just about Densha de Go Nagoya Tetsudou-hen and the minigames they created to take advantage of having a one-axis controller that locked in the middle. I think you've seen enough of the minigames now, so let's hop back into the rest of the video. But all that said, this is a solid package of new content for Densha de Go, though it might not be the first one that you'd want to pick up. We're back in the arcades for Densha de Go 3 Tsuukin-hen, or Commuter Edition. And if you're curious why I'm saying Densha de Go 3 instead of Densha de Go Sun, well, the Densha de Go series uses the English words for the numbers. Of course, I'm not playing the arcade version here, I'm playing the PlayStation 2 version. It's a little bit easier to get that shipped to you from Japan. As the title implies, we're back to commuter lines. They're spread across 3 regions, and each region has 3 lines. The big feature for Densha de Go 3 was the real-time clock. The game has the official timetables for all of the lines that you drive, and you have to drive those schedules, and the environment changes to reflect the time of day. Though, at least on the home version, you can rotate to any time of day that you like. That means that this is really our first time where we get to drive a train at night. Another aspect to having the real-world schedules is that this game enforces those schedules a lot harder than the previous ones. Densha de Go already had a feature where it would change the signals ahead of you to slow you down if you were going too fast. But it becomes a lot more strict about this in Densha de Go 3, and you're going to see it a lot. Half the lines are new and half the lines are returning, and that resulted in one oddity that I'm sure is intentional. The very first line that you'd play as the tutorial in the original Densha de Go is the most difficult line in Densha de Go 3. This is a harsher game than the previous console games I've been talking about, because it is an arcade game, and so a lot of the things that were introduced to make Densha de Go easier to play have all been stripped back. You don't have the view of the track ahead of you and the distance to signals, and the constraints are a lot tighter. On the advanced difficulty courses, you have to stop the train at the 0 meter mark, in other words, plus or minus 50 centimeters. At least the free driving mode has returned. It's family driving here, and that just lets you drive the line with no concern about speed limits or train stations or making any stops. On the other hand, there's also an extreme difficulty mode, where it removes the indicator for the distance to the next station. Penalties are much higher when you drive in this mode, but bonuses are also much higher. Densha de Go 3 pushes the series back toward the arcade, and so it really feels like a step backward if you've been playing every single game. Even the lines aren't that interesting. There's really only one of them that gets you out of a generic urban environment. Unless you took these lines every day yourself and could go, "Oh, I know this place," there isn't much to see here. A weirdly annoying addition in Densha de Go 3 is the rumble. On the PlayStation 2 version, if you use the controller, they really crank the rumble hard as you drive. Once you get the train up to speed, that controller will try to shake itself right out of your hands. Fortunately, they walked this back a lot with later games. Basically, Densha de Go 3 is one of the weaker entries in the series, and probably not the one you'd want to start with. Take everything you knew about Densha de Go and throw it out. Densha de Go Ryojou-hen is the most radical departure for the series that we've seen. This is the odd man out among the entire Densha de Go series. The title means the feelings that you have while traveling edition. And yeah, that's really long-winded, but this is one of those cases where there is no short English word. Just as that title implies, Ryojou-hen is all about tram lines at popular tourist destinations. This started out in the arcade, and it's the very last arcade game in the classic Densha de Go series. And of course, I'm using the PlayStation 2 version here. The biggest difference between the arcade version and the PS2 version is that the PS2 version is a lot more lenient, and it has a special mode where you can check out attractions that are along the line. Like I said, this one's all about the tourism. Like Densha de Go 3, Ryojou-hen can take into account the system time and replicate the real-world time of day, plus replicate the timetable for a tram that would be running around then. This game has its own specialty controller. You really can't use the classic Densha de Go controller with it, and part of that is because the brakes on all of these trams are pneumatic. They're analog. You set a level and the pressure builds up, and then you push it all the way back to the left to release all of the pressure on the brakes. And besides the pneumatic braking system, there's also some other functions that you need, which just aren't available on the other Densha de Go controllers. You'll notice that as I'm driving, it doesn't tell me the distance to the next station until I'm pulling into it. That doesn't matter as much because you're likely to be driving at a much lower speed here. Or at least you shouldn't be pulling into stations at 60 kilometers per hour because you just won't be able to stop. The trams do stop very quickly, but there's now a G-force meter, and stopping too hard will give you a penalty. The stations are also extremely short, since the trams are only 1 or 2 cars long, which of course means less room to stop. You'll notice that there isn't a rolling ticker at the top of the screen, letting you know your current points. Now, all points and penalties for a line segment are applied when you stop at the station. So when you come to a stop, you get a brief list of all your bonuses and penalties that you've accrued during that leg. And there's a lot more potential penalties now. The reason for that is you have a lot more control. You control the doors, you control the station announcements, you control the drink service. Okay, not really on that last one. What this means is that it changes up how every leg works. You no longer depart from the station when the doors close automatically, you have to close the doors yourself. Then you drive off and you have to make the station announcement, get to the next station, and if you're late, you get a penalty, though it's not a continuous one. You also have to obey all of the traffic lights and signals, but you do get bonuses if you honk at every crossing. When you reach the next station, you have to make the station arrival announcement, and then pull up and stop 3 meters or less from the end of the platform. If you go past the end of the platform even by 1 centimeter, then you get a full penalty for missing the station, and the game moves you back. Finally, you have to open the doors on the appropriate side, since you don't want people jumping out onto the street, and then you get to see the total for that leg. There's a relaxed mode that gives you lots of points to start with, and a hardcore mode that's a lot closer to the arcade version. There are only 4 lines in Ryojou-hen, but they are extremely long lines. There's over a dozen stops on them, so it's about half an hour of driving to complete any given line. Densha de Go Ryojou-hen is a very different game from the rest of the series. It's interesting from the perspective of expanding Densha de Go, but it's also not really what you expect from the series. We're getting back to normal with Densha de Go Shinkansen, or kind of normal. We've been driving a lot of commuters and tourists around, but this game is dedicated to long-distance travel. This is all about driving the bullet train. Weirdly enough, this does not offer continuous driving from one end of Japan to the other, and the reason for that is the Shinkansen tracks are operated by 3 different companies: JR West, JR East, and JR Central. Well, JR West and JR East gave permission to use their lines, JR Central didn't. As a result, the game only focuses on the JR West Shinkansen branches. There's a training section with JR East, but you'll just have to be satisfied driving from Osaka to Hakata. One thing that becomes a problem for the Densha de Go series from this point on are bugs. The original PlayStation 2 version of Densha de Go Shinkansen was notoriously buggy. In particular, the game was plagued by slowdowns, and considering it's all about driving a high-speed train, that's not really great. Taito provided fixed versions, but if you want to avoid it, I recommend picking up the re-release as part of the Eternal Hits line. There's also an enhanced version that came out for the Wii called Densha de Go Shinkansen EX, though I don't have that one for reasons that will be obvious as I go. The EX version has also recently been re-released as a standalone plug-and-play unit that connects directly to your television. The console versions have a special Shinkansen controller, which has a functional digital readout on it. It has a speedometer, indicator for stress on the vehicles, and a door indicator. So how is it to drive the Shinkansen? In a word, boring, and completely lacking in any kind of challenge. No disrespect to real Shinkansen drivers, who I'm sure have to deal with all sorts of problems, but the game version makes their job look like complete tedium. One of the major problems here is the length of the line. It is 20 to 30 minutes between stops. You'll pass through other stations, and which train you're driving will determine how often you stop, but if you drive any of the really high-speed ones, which is kind of why you'd play, then the way it works is you get the train up to speed at the start, and then 20 minutes later you brake again. Okay, there's a couple of places where you're required to slow down, and you'll want to feather your throttle a little bit to to make sure you don't trigger the active track control, which will automatically brake the train. But that really isn't a whole lot to keep you engaged. There are some checkpoints that add a little bit to the game. Spots where you want to pass at particular times, or spots where you want to pass while traveling at a particular speed. But those checkpoints are typically at the maximum speed that you'd be traveling, so the speed that you're required to go in order to get to the next station on time. And the timing checkpoints basically come down to, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing with the train? There's so little going on here that they occasionally have to give you vignettes of what's occurring within the train. You get a little feedback of how you're driving with the happy passenger bar, but the only real measurement occurs when you reach the next stop, where you're graded on how you performed, and then if you have a high enough cumulative score, you're allowed to go on to the next leg of the trip. This is the Densha de Go game that just doesn't work. The coolness factor of driving a super fast train goes away really fast when you realize that you're just driving fast through nothingness. Feel free to read that as a comment on the human condition. Densha de Go Shinkansen is the Densha de Go game that I just never go back to. It's the one that's just no fun. The next game in the series might be the polar opposite. Densha de Go Professional 2 is what happens when Taito looks at the title and goes, "Oh yeah, we should make this for professionals." So it has the longest lines in the series, nearly 40 stops for the longest of them, and it will take you around 2 hours to drive from the start to the finish of it. And I'm speaking from experience there. Fortunately, you don't have to do it all in one sitting. There's now a save and load function, so you can drive the entire distance across Kyuushuu without being tied to your PS2 for hours. No, right, there's shorter lines also. In keeping with the professional title, the game is also now a lot more strict about the schedule. You will be penalized for arriving too early. Of course, the easy way to address this is to drive really fast and then go kind of slow through the station. You'll still have to get a feel for how the trains handle, though, if you're going to do that properly. A nice addition are the visual markers as you pull into the stations. It's a lot easier to visualize where you're supposed to stop with these guide gates. There's only 5 lines in this one, but since 2 of them are super long, Professional 2 comes in only behind the Shinkansen version in length of track to drive, and the driving here is a lot better. They return to the points system where you can always see how you're doing at the top of the screen, and penalties will be applied as you drive. Naturally, there are also penalties applied at the station. However, there's also now plenty of chances for bonuses. Returning from Shinkansen are the markers along the line where you have to pass them at certain speeds or at certain times. If you're dead on, you get bonuses. On a longer route, my record was getting up to about 120 points, so it's very doable to build up your score. Unfortunately, this is another buggy release. There are some places where there are required horn signals that don't show up until you've already passed them, and something that will drive real fans crazy is how on some lines, sometimes it will wind up playing the wrong announcements. There's a version that was released under the Taito Best line that fixes some of these problems, but that's the version I have, and I've encountered some crashes with it. Densha de Go Professional 2 is definitely not a game for beginners, but if you think that you're good at Densha de Go, then this is the one to pick up next. This one is the final boss of the Densha de Go series. It's the ultimate challenge. And so we come to the last game in the classic Densha de Go series, the appropriately titled Densha de Go Final. If you're someone very familiar with the Densha de Go series and are saying, wait, what about... Look at the length of this video and how much time is left. I will get to it. Densha de Go Final became the torch carrier for the series for almost a decade. When Taito decided to test the waters on a revival by releasing a plug-and-play unit, it was Densha de Go Final that they re-released. When they dabbled in portable versions, they broke up Densha de Go Final into multiple games and released each line as its own disc for the PSP. And here's the thing about Final. It is the best Densha de Go game. When people ask me where do they start with Densha de Go, something that has come up oddly more often than you might think, I tell them Densha de Go Final. If you play any of the games I'm going over in this video, play this one. Densha de Go Final only contains 4 lines. However, 2 of those lines are the Yamanote line and the Osaka Loop line. And this is the first time in any video game that the entire circuit of those lines has been included. The other 2 lines included are the Chuuou line and the Tokaido main line, which means 3 out of the 4 lines have appeared in Densha de Go before, though in a very truncated form. There's also a weird situation with those lines, where there are extended versions of 2 of them, but they were only playable in store demo kiosks. You can find that demo disc around, though you'll have to pay for it. The way that Densha de Go Final handles the lines is that you start out with a few basic runs available. Conditions are fine, and you're driving only a small portion of the track. As you drive those, you earn credits that are used to purchase additional stages. Maybe it gives you a different train that's harder to use, or you have to drive more of the track, or the weather conditions are worse, or there's problems that require that you change speed constantly. Basically, they're giving you game progression. And I didn't have too much trouble unlocking more difficult stages. I didn't have to grind for credits. Playing one stage extremely well will probably get you enough to unlock another stage. And on the harder, more expensive stages, if you drive them well, you'll earn a lot more credits. So the whole system works pretty well. And credits don't just come from pulling into the station. Densha de Go Final now has a chart that shows you everything up to 500 meters ahead of your train. And anytime there's a speed change or a checkpoint, you earn credits if you're doing things right at that point. You also get credits for pulling into the station pretty close to on time. It's plus or minus 3 seconds with extra points for coming in exactly on time. And of course for how close you are to the stop mark. Keep doing things right and you'll build up a chain, which gets you more credits. So there's a bit of a feedback loop here too. Rather than points that get penalized every time you do something wrong, now you have passengers. And if you've been doing poorly, when you pull into a station, they get off the train. Once you run out of passengers, you can't continue. Densha de Go Final is also one of the easier games in the series, part of that refocusing on the score. You'll find that the braking is a lot more powerful in this game, making it easier to scream into the station at high speed, and then brake hard to stop at just the right spot. Although, the G-meter is back, and if you throw your passengers around too hard, it's going to count against you. So with Densha de Go Final, it feels good to drive, it's a lot more accessible for new players, they improve the arcade aspects, giving you something to do constantly. It all makes for the best Densha de Go experience. The only thing I don't like in it is that all of the lines are in an urban environment. It's nice to get a variety of scenery. This is the Densha de Go game to play if you've never played Densha de Go before. Okay, we've been on a ride through the Densha de Go series for quite a while now, so before I get back to driving more trains, how about we dip over for something completely different? There are fewer train-based shooters than you might think. It's not uncommon for trains to be bosses in shoot-'em-ups, or stages where you're following a train or on board a train, but very few action games where you're in control of the train. Just 2 came to mind for me while I was going through things, and they're both PlayStation 1 games, which lends credence to my theory that the heyday of train video games was around the time of Densha de Go. First up is Mad Panic Coaster. And if you're saying that a roller coaster is not a train, they literally call the vehicles that you ride in on them trains. So this is a train game, even if the circuit is really small. The concept in Mad Panic Coaster is that you have to do 3 laps of a roller coaster. You can throw bombs out ahead of you to destroy things that get in your way, and you can go left and right to lean your train a bit, trying to keep it on the tracks. This isn't a car where it will go straight when you reach a turn, but the centrifugal force of a turn will pull the train off. You can also jump to get over holes in the track, or dodge enemies. All in all, it's a very simple action game consisting of 5 stages that look just like this. This game is peak late 90s. The art, the music, you might even be able to stretch it and say the coaster is an extreme sport. It's hard to imagine a game being more 1997. And that style is really the main reason to play Mad Panic Coaster. The gameplay is not awful, but it is a bit out of control. If you just concentrate on staying on the track, you'll probably do pretty well. Actually, aiming at and shooting targets is pretty hard. It makes Mad Panic Coaster closer to rail shooters like Panzer Dragoon, only with no lock-on. If you like this style of game but don't want the shooting, well, stay tuned. I'll get there. Now here's a much more traditional shoot-'em-up that happens to be on rails. The Rail Loaders takes place in a world where all of the people are trains, rather similar to the Cars movies. The infant child of the King of Raillands has been abducted, and 2 of his knights are in pursuit. The Rail Loaders is intended as a cooperative-ish game. I guess technically you would cooperate, but mainly I see how easy it is to interfere with each other. If you're playing by yourself, there's a ghost second player who never actually does anything except stay with you. Although if you wind up overlapping with them, they'll interfere with you a lot. And like I said, this is much more of a shoot-'em-up. You're riding the rails, and you can fire a bubble out in front of you to clear the path. There's a shot meter at the bottom of the screen to indicate how strong your bubble will be, but it fills up pretty fast, so mainly it's there to prevent you from mashing the fire button. If you can't knock something out of the way, or you don't want to collect the item on the track, you can also jump over it. You've got full control over your motion, forward and back, and if you come up to a junction with a lever, you can pull that to switch tracks, or sometimes interact with elements of the stage. I found the levers to be oddly fiddly. Sometimes it would register 2 pulls when I hit the button once, and the alignment had to be fairly precise. You can take 2 hits before you die in the Rail Loaders, and that includes running into dead ends. So if you see one coming up, slow down. There's a few different power-ups to collect, ones that will increase the strength and range of your bubble, ones that increase how fast your train can move, and there's also plenty of power downs littering the track. Most of the rest of the things you'll find are just points. Though if you encounter certain trains, not all of them, and they're likely to talk to you before this happens, then you can add a car to your train, which will give you an extra attack. At the end of stages, you leave the tracks behind and fly around to shoot a boss. There's only 5 stages in the Rail Loader, and this is one of those shoot-'em-ups where they let you continue as many times as you like, so that you can try to learn the game and do better next time. Honestly, the Rail Loaders is kinda bad. The way it controls feels pretty awful, and having a second ghost player is just confusing. There's also not enough going on with the game. Your bubble shot just goes straight. The alternate weapon options are rare and not especially interesting, and the game doesn't really take advantage of its theming with the action. If you play the Rail Loaders, you'll be constantly thinking, well, why didn't they do it this way? That'd be so much better. Like they could have had independent aiming, more environmental hazards affecting the track, some kind of signal or indicator to make the choice of path significant. The Rail Loaders is a waste of an idea. It should be better, but it's not. While the other games in this chapter are all going to have a particular theme, I have to squeeze in Tomi's Densha Daisuki first. That's a title that translates to I Love Trains. Tomi got into the train game business because they were already in the train business. Tomi's Plow Rail series was, and continues to be, extremely successful. It's a very simple model train kit for children. Big plastic rails, motorized toys. They also have the Tomix line for model train hobbyists. If you're already making trains, and you have a video game division, then making a video game about trains is just good business synergy. In fact, Densha Daisuki has a Tomy catalog in it. You can look through the models and rails that you can buy. There's only one problem with this plan. Tomy's video game division was a disaster. I won't speak about the quality of their trains because I don't have experience there, but virtually all of their video games are god-awful. The ones that aren't feel like weird outliers. And Densha Daisuki is pretty bad. The game is a pretty blatant copy of Densha de Go, though worse in just about every respect. There's only 2 train lines, and they make you run them endlessly. When you start out, you only have access to level 1 routes, which are both on the same line and just have you drive a slightly different train. There's no real difference between any of the trains here, despite the fact that you have to unlock them. No change in interface, no difference in speed, you don't even get to see your train. You have to drive a certain number of stops on the line, and you're given a schedule. And then you go to it. There are no speed limits here. Once the door closes, you can crank it up all the way and let it go. There are several kilometers between each station, so you are going to want to get the speed up to at least 100 kilometers an hour. You have 100 points when you start out, and points are deducted anytime you do something wrong, like try to drive away from the station before the doors close, or overshoot a station. Points are also taken away for being too fast or too slow when you reach the stop. But those are all of the penalties. So an easy way to play the game is to go really fast to the next station, stop 10 meters before the actual stop, and then sit there until time catches up, then do that final pull-in. If you do overshoot the station, then you have to back up to the stop. You can reverse the train's direction, but the train does have to be stopped first. There are no breaks between legs of the trip, so you pull into the station, then you wait for the doors to close again, and just take off once more. The interface for the brake and accelerator on the left-hand side is a bit deceptive. Just like in Densha de Go, there's 5 speeds for acceleration and 8 degrees of braking. Though the way it's drawn, it looks like there's only 4 of each. You have 100 points that you're assigned when you start running a line in Densha Daisuki, and similar to Densha de Go, these are stripped away when you do something wrong. When you complete a run of a line, if you have enough points left, then you unlock additional trains to drive. These are given at different levels, but I didn't really see a difference between level 1 and level 3, other than the number of stations they want you to stop at. The strangest thing about Densha Daisuki is that it came with a controller. Kind of. It came with a controller-shaped box that you put your PlayStation controller into, and then mechanically, as you pulled the accelerator and brake lever, it tapped up and down on your controller. I haven't been able to get my hands on one of these. They're not expensive, but they're also not very common, because no one really wants them. The whole package gives you a real, we have Densha de Go at home kind of feel. Strangely, this is Tomi's second train video game. The first was released a week before Densha Daisuki, but it's a little bit different, and I've got a special category for that, so we'll talk about it later. Now we're hitting a bit of a creative one, with Hasha Orai Gatan Goton. That last part's supposed to be onomatopoeia for the sounds of train tracks. Gatan Goton. Gatan Goton. You could translate Hasha Orai to all aboard. Okay, really it means let's go, but it's specifically for the departure of trains, so let's just say all aboard. And the gimmick of the game is that, similar to Train Simulator, you're getting video. Except it's video from the perspective of an N-gauge train. N-gauge being 1/150th scale. Hamster published Gatan Goton as a budget title at the very end of the PlayStation's life, The PS2 had already been out a while when this reached shelves. However, it did get a leg up on the competition because this is the first train game on a console to use video playback for the graphics. Train Simulator had already been doing this for years over on computers, but they wouldn't make the console jump for a few more months. There's only one line in Gatan Goton, and it's not a real one. I mean being even less real than a model railway. There are 9 stations on the line, and they're all real stations. They're just stations from all over Japan. So you can depart from Tokyo Station, and then arrive at Osaka Station a few stops down. They vary things up a little bit by giving you different sections of the track to drive, and since it's a loop, they can splice the ends of the video together, and then the start and stop points become arbitrary. In an amusing coincidence, the trains and scenery that you see in the game is all by Tomy. So Tomy has a second train game here, though fortunately they didn't have anything to do with the programming on this one. The gameplay fits the usual model: drive between stations on a schedule, stay below the speed limit when you have a signal that's warning you. The actual controls are a bit of a pain. Rather than locking into a position, when you press a button on the controller, it starts spinning the accelerator or brake to the maximum, and then you have to lock it in place. The brakes will stop when you release the button, but the accelerator will snap back to 0 unless you hold down L1. It's just a bizarre interface, and it makes feathering the brakes as you pull into the station way harder than it should be. When you complete a run on the line, you're given a score based on a whole bunch of performance stats, and then if you've done well enough, you'll unlock additional trains to drive. If you don't want to drive the timetable, then you can just go fast. They have that option for people who just want to see the train scenery. Gatan Goton isn't a good game, but it's a unique game. And it's one of the things that inspired this video, because I was thinking of making a video just about it. There's no other train game out there that gives you the perspective of driving around a model diorama. And at the very least, that makes it worth taking a look. Finally, I come to Densha de Go's big competitor. Well, I'm coming back to them, but this is the point where the competition is heating up. With the release of the PlayStation 2, Ongakukan made the leap to consoles with their Train Simulator series. There's 8 major entries in their console line, and I'm not going to hit every single one of them, because unlike Densha de Go, Train Simulator maintained kind of a steady course. Also, one of the games has its line take place 2/3 in a subway, so the scenery there isn't even really worth looking at. Initially, Ongakukan partnered with Sony themselves for these releases. 2 games were published by Sony as part of the Train Simulator Real series, one with the Yamanote line, and the other with the Keihin Kyuko line. 2 very popular lines to use in these train games, and I'm playing the Yamanote version here. They recorded footage of the entire Yamanote line, and you're traveling in a clockwise loop around it, starting at Osaki. The reason that all of these games that have you drive the Yamanote line start at Osaki is because that's where the depot is. Thanks to being on DVD rather than a CD, the video is much higher resolution, and it's recorded in decent-ish quality for 2001. The way that the technology works is that it's just varying the playback speed of the video and making that match the speed that the train is traveling at. The train that they recorded footage from was traveling at about 70 kilometers per hour, and it wasn't stopping in stations. So you'll notice some funny artifacts when you're traveling at slower speeds. Of course, being on video means that Train Simulator is limited to just 1 line per release. They probably could have squeezed 2 on here, but the 1 line per game was their business model. The really distinctive thing about these Train Simulator games is the driving model. Densha de Go is rather loose about this. And that's fine, it reflects its arcade roots. Train Simulator, on the other hand, well, you can see how the train's behavior changes as half of it crosses the threshold on a change of track grade. If you're heading downhill, suddenly that back half of your train is pushing you a lot harder. The game even models how full the train is. When you're driving a packed train at rush hour, It brakes and accelerates differently than when you're driving a lightly filled one in the afternoon. The number on the train picture on the right-hand side is a percentage of how loaded the train is. The instrument panel on the train accurately reflects a real one, but you'll probably find it easier to read the information on the game's heads-up display. Although, you can turn that off and try to drive just like a real train. Unlike Densha de Go, Train Simulator is just about driving. There's no points or score. You have to really screw up for the game to just stop. And there's only a few different options for driving, mainly what time of day and which style of train you're on. While these aren't as strong of games as Densha de Go, the reason that you'd get them is that higher quality video and the realistic feel for the driving. But there isn't much in the way of game here. After Ongaku-kan released their second game with Sony, they ended their relationship with the media giant and started publishing the Train Simulator games for consoles themselves. And in this new era, they made the biggest console series crossover since Capcom fought SNK. Train Simulator plus Densha de Go brought Ongaku-kan's video style and driving models together with Taito's arcadish action. Of course, since Ongaku-kan was developing the game, they only included a single line on the disc, Tokyo Kyuushuu-hen. Though there are two different entry points for driving the line, one in the subway, one in the suburbs. There's an express line that connects Shibuya in Tokyo with Yokohama. Of course, the big thing here is that you can choose whether you want to play in Train Simulator mode or in Densha de Go mode. Densha de Go mode will look pretty familiar at this point. One of the major differences is that they put the guide to the track ahead of you at the bottom of the screen. It looks a little bit odd, but it's perfectly functional. But beyond that, it's the Densha de Go you know. You start with 40 points for the run of the line, and have to arrive on time and stop precisely. Also, since this is an express train, you're not going to be stopping at every station, so passing those at the correct time gets you extra points. There is no pulling into the station view for this one, and if you do overshoot, then you press start to rewind the video back to the end of the station. Train Simulator mode works just like the other Train Simulator games. There's no scoring element or concern for being eliminated, though you do have to drive effectively if you want to unlock additional things. One significant thing about this crossover is that it supported Ongaku-kan's special multi-train controller. This might be the most over-engineered peripheral I have seen for a console. While technically it is a one-lever controller for a train, just like they had for Densha de Go, you can remove portions of it to re-gear the lever for other trains. Basically changing where the stop points are and giving you different information alongside it. These controllers are wildly expensive to get now, especially with the additional inserts to change what type of train you're driving. This is the first of the Train Simulator games that gets ported to the PSP. Ongaku-kan had a brief time when they were bringing some of their older games to Sony's handheld when it was a new system, and as far as I can tell, there weren't any compromises made in the port. Just some lower resolution video because it's on the PSP. Blending Train Simulator and Densha de Go together makes a bit of an odd taste. Playing it as Densha de Go is a lot harder than the standard Densha de Go games, especially in the PS2 era when they were trying to pull back that difficulty. Maybe that's why Taito and Ongaku-kan didn't team up again, at least in the PS2 era. Of course, Ongaku-kan had to take their crack at the Shinkansen. So did they figure out the magic formula to make driving a high-speed bullet train interesting? No. In fact, it's somehow even worse than Taito's attempt with Densha de Go. Train Simulator Kyuushuu Shinkansen has you driving the train across Japan's southern island, and you can drive it in both directions. That means there's video going both ways. One of the videos starts before dawn, so all you can see is the track ahead of you and the train's headlight. By the end of the line, the sun has started to come up a bit, but it's still a bewildering choice for a series where its strongest selling point is the view from the train cockpit. Not that there's really that much to see when it's daytime and you're going the other direction, because most of the line is in tunnels that stretch for kilometers. On top of that, it can easily be over 10 minutes between stations. And if you're driving the express one, you don't even stop. So you get up to speed, and then you just maintain that speed for 20 minutes. A quirk of the game is that since the Shinkansen has the accelerator on the right and the brakes on the left, so they've reversed the controls from every other train driving game that we've seen so far. As I pointed out before, the issue with the Shinkansen games is that there's enormous stretches of just doing nothing. And the train simulator entry for this has actually made those problems worse. I feel like Ongakkon didn't really have a great grasp on how to best take advantage of their video format, and this package is a really good example of that. The era of the PlayStation 2 is over, and with it, train games are fading away. Taito has ended the Densha de Go series, but Ongakkon thought, what if we kept it going? Taito agreed to the idea, but Ongakkon would have to use a different name. I mean, it'd be silly to call the game Densha de Go Final and not have it be the last one, right? And so, once more, Densha de Go and Train Simulator merged together, this time under the title Railfan. And for the first time with one of these Japanese publishers, they decided to get out of Japan. The first Railfan emphasized that you could drive the Chicago Brown Line. That's the loop line that runs on elevated tracks around downtown Chicago. But because they wouldn't want to turn off their Japanese fans, there's two other train lines included. The Chuuou line, which cuts across Tokyo, and the Keihan line, which connects Osaka and Kyoto. Both of which we've seen multiple times as I've been going through these train games. The Keihan line in particular is extremely long for something in a train simulator game. Over 40 stations. Ongakkon was clearly taking advantage of the space available on that Blu-ray disc. This happens to be the first Japanese game I ever imported, and I now have nearly 2,000 Japanese games that I've imported. So, thanks, Railfan. Railfan's a little bit odd because they don't just let you drive in and start playing Densha de Go. Instead, they require you to complete a series of missions. And by missions, I mean a very, very basic tutorial. How to make the train accelerate, how to make the train stop, what the signs mean, how to pull into a station. It's the kind of thing that the original Densha de Go explained in playing one segment of one line, but here it makes you do them all piecemeal, going back to the menu and then restarting a new tutorial. Once you've done all the tutorials, then you can play Densha de Go on the line. And that last line mission is even called Densha de Go. The brown line's a rather unusual line to drive. You can see on the track view on the left-hand side that there's two different speed numbers. And that's because the line has active track control, which will automatically cause the train to adjust its speed if you go too fast, and speed limits, which are often much lower than that. The brown line was built in 1907, so it's kinda rickety and very slow. There are a lot of points where you're going to crawl along at just 15 miles an hour. And yes, here it's miles an hour, not kilometers. We're driving a train in the US of A, and we'll only have imperial measurements, thank you very much. So the brown line is awfully rickety, slow, and the stations are packed really close together. It makes for a very different feeling line from anything else in the Densha de Go series. Hey, the Art Institute's over there. Let's hop off and go do that. that was transcendent. Fun and transcendent. Anyways, back to the trains. A distinctive addition to Railfan is the picture-in-picture function. It's actually taking advantage of native Blu-ray playback functionality. And you can switch between the cockpit view or the chase view, which was shot from a following helicopter, or sometimes on the city streets when they couldn't get the helicopter down in there. Another big new feature is the indicator to show roughly how far you'll go when you brake, though the triangle's point seems to be an idealized spot, and on the brown line you lose speed a lot faster than that. Maybe the biggest disappointment in Railfan is that there is no train controller for the PlayStation 3. Okay, you could always use one of those weird adapters, but it's not like the game will actually recognize it. While the forced tutorials annoy me as somebody who's now played a lot of train games, Railfan is a pretty good entry point for the genre. It gives you some pretty stiff penalties when you do something wrong, but also gives you big rewards for being on time and pulling into the station just right. So once you're past the initial hump, it's pretty easy. Definitely a good choice for the newcomer. The second Railfan game had to drop Taito as a publisher, so that meant the Densha de Go mode was gone. Railfan Taiwan Takaketsu, or Taiwan High Speed Rail if you want to use the English title given, is another attempt by Gatan to make driving a high-speed train interesting, and they've already lost one of their biggest strengths for that. While I'm playing the Japanese release here, this game has the interesting distinction of an English release, just not in the US or Europe. The English version was prepared for the Southeast Asian market, and presumably they would have released it elsewhere if it had done well. There are 3 different driving modes here. There's a time trial where you're completing an underground track, going around the circuit as fast as you can. You'll quickly notice in this mode that the camera that they mounted to the front of the train was not intended for low-light situations. Trial driving is the standard train simulator mode. You can drive the entire route that consists of 8 stations and roughly 300 kilometers of track. And just like other high-speed rail driving that we've seen, most of the track is open, flat, and there's a long time between stations, so all you do is push the throttle to the max and sit there for a long time. There is scoring in this mode, and it counts up when you pass certain points on time, or appropriately stop at the station. The final mode is probably the most interesting of them. It's all about efficiently driving the train. You're given 1 megawatt of power, and you need to see how far you can get down the line with that. So you'll need to know where you need to sit on the accelerator to efficiently use it, and you'll need to do a similar thing with your braking to make sure you're efficiently using that speed you built up. If you do a good job in this mode, then you're awarded extra power. I managed to get about 4 stations down the line before I ran out. But apparently it is possible to drive the whole line like this. Railfan Taiwan Takaketsu is the end for the Train Simulator series. After this, Gatan moves over to professional simulators, ones built for actual railroad companies in order to train their drivers. Train games weren't doing well, so it was time for them to get out. However, they exited right before a new generation of train games began. A train game revolution was coming, and Gatan and Taito missed it. But we'll get to those stories soon enough. Most of the games I've looked at so far have been about precision driving, getting to the station on time while obeying all signals. But what if you just want to go fast? What if you want to open up that throttle and try to keep the train on the tracks as you scream around a corner? And you wanted to do all of that as a driving beat was playing. Well, someone thought of that, and they released that game as Tetsu-One Densha de Battle. Well, are you expecting something else? The concept here is that there's a railroad Grand Prix, 6 tracks spread across Japan, and all of the best trains, or their legally distinct counterparts, show up to compete. Every region has 8 trains that you can drive, and they're rated on things like acceleration, top speed, braking, and how well they can handle hills and curves. And then you pick out a course and start driving. You'll race against 5 other trains at the same time, each starting at a platform in parallel. But once the race starts, it'll quickly shrink down to 4 tracks. If you're approaching a junction, you can hit L1 and R1 to switch, but sorry, there's no multi-track drifting here. The challenge is to find ways around your rivals, and keep your train on the tracks as it's going around curves. There actually is a kind of racing line. You'll likely want to be on the inside track when you hit a curve, but the additional forces on the turn are more likely to throw you off. So you'll want to brake as you go in, accelerate as you come out, and you can use the right thumbstick to lean the train a little bit. Give you that tiny extra amount of grip. If you get thrown off, or somebody rams you off, then you need to shake the right thumbstick in order to get back on the rails. You can also wait until you cross a junction, but that could take a while. There are shortcuts and hidden routes on every track as well, so you can find ways to sneak ahead. Or I guess you could just drive super aggressively and knock everyone else off their tracks. That works too. At the end of the route, the line breaks up into 6 platforms again, and you'll have to pull into an unoccupied one. Stop there to end the race. I'm not going to say Tetsu-One is a brilliant game. It's kind of simple and there's way too little content. On the other hand, it does one thing, and it does it in a very amusing way. There's even a 2-player split-screen battle mode if you wanted to race your friends. This was one of the games that was making me go, I have to show other people this. It's delightful. It's got its problems, but it's energetic, goofy, and fun for the 2 or 3 hours it'll take you to finish everything in the game. It just doesn't have any staying power either. About 6 months later, they followed Tetsu-One up with a sequel, Tetsu-One Densha de Battle World Grand Prix. And this actually got a release outside of Japan. It was published as Extreme Express in the UK. The game's almost identical to the original one. In fact, it's so close, I probably wouldn't have included it in this video except for one reason, and that's because I wanted to show off the national livery on the trains. Canadians, this one's for you. But it's still 6 tracks, about the same number of trains, though a lot of them have to be unlocked by racing. The game has been completely translated into English, probably to try to sell it overseas, but that's just about the only significant change. On the other hand, that does mean that if you want to play one of these Densha de Battle games, World Grand Prix is the one to get. Or, you know, you could get both and have a good time. You've probably seen this image online. It got passed around as a meme a while ago. It's taken from a parody comic that merges the worlds of Initial D and Densha de Go together. Initial D is a very long-running series all about street racing in the mountains of Japan. A lot of synchronized cars drifting around corners together, winding roads at night, and the racing elevated to high drama because there's nothing in the world more important than street racing. Mash Initial D and Densha de Go together, and you have Densha de D, a parody about the high-stakes world of street racing trains. A series of games followed. I'm playing Shining Stage, the 5th and most recent entry in the series, and also one of the easier ones. Densha de D is a hobby project of one person, so the games are a little bit rough, the graphics are kind of primitive, but they have the fun absurdity of racing trains as hard as you can. The key to these games, after you get up to speed, is that you can jump the tracks to parallel ones and engage in some multi-track drifting. This gets you a speed boost, but if the tracks come apart, or if there's a station platform, or something along those lines, then you could easily crash. When you hit a curve, you can see how well your cars are sticking to the track, and if they're about to come off, then you can brake a bit, and if you're in really big trouble, you can always try to jump over to the other track even if it's occupied, since that will straighten you out. That does cost some speed though. As you're racing, the story is playing out around you, and you'll get panels that appear and voiceovers of breathless people telling you how significant what's currently happening is. It's all leading into the comedy. I'll be honest here, I'm not super fond of the Densha de series. Not because it's mocking Densha de Go. I mean, who cares about that? I just find the games to be kind of poorly balanced. Stages are either trivially easy or impossibly difficult, and success and failure can often feel out of your hands. Which isn't to say I hate them, or don't respect the effort that goes into making them. It's just the gameplay in Densha de winds up falling a bit flat for me. Oh well, stuff can't be for everyone. I've already been through a lot of different ways to drive a train. But what about when you're not at home? How do you drive a train if you're on your daily commute? Well, of course there are ways to do that. The earliest ones that I know of are tiny little LCD games based on Densha de Go. I found 5 different ones over the years, including one that vibrates as it plays. These are all tiny devices that would basically fit on a keychain. None of them are really what you'd want to play, or would show up well on video, so let's move on. The first train game for a portable game system is Coconut Japan's Pocket Densha, or Pocket Train. Released for the Game Boy in 1998, Pocket Densha is definitely trying to ride on Densha de Go's coattails. There are 3 different lines that you can drive: the Yamanote line, the Osaka Loop line, and the Subaru Shinkansen, which is only accessible if you can complete the previous 2. You can already see that the graphics look like a flickery mess, and that's because they're designed to take advantage of the poor refresh rate on the original Game Boy screen. So it looks bad on a Game Boy, and it looks even worse on a Super Game Boy or Game Boy Player, the common methods for getting video out from a Game Boy game. So take some solace that it does look very slightly better on an awful screen. We're just going to have to live with it looking this bad here though. There aren't any real signals in the game. You have a speed limit of 90 that's always in place. This gets reduced to 70 when there's a curve. That's what the R symbol means. And when you're pulling into a station, it's reduced to 50. When you approach a station, the game switches to a side view, though it's not like that actually helps you identify where to stop. And yeah, this game is a complete and total mess. Some of that is the hardware limitations, like how if you apply brakes, the music cuts out, but also it doesn't feel very good to control. There's not a lot happening as you're driving the lines. Visually, it's boring. This just isn't a game that anyone would want to play. If you're not familiar with Coconuts Japan, they're best known for a series of pachinko games. Not pachinko machines, pachinko games. And in 1998, when Pocket Densha was released, the company was dying. They'd only last about 10 more months after Pocket Densha's release. So anyway, 6 months later they released Pocket Densha 2. This time it's for the Game Boy Color. I'll admit that Pocket Densha 2 is a lot better than the original Pocket Densha. Of course, that was an incredibly low bar to clear. This time there are 4 lines: the Odawara line, an Oshima line, Takaya line, and a metro line to the Kansai airport. The game now runs a lot more smoothly, and it even gives you proper feedback as you're driving, showing you speed limits rather than vague signs. Of course, now it's a lot easier to criticize the rest of the game. The driving model is awful. The train accelerates way too fast. You also brake very quickly, but you'll go from 0 to 80 in about 10 seconds, which makes fine adjustments of speed rather difficult. They also don't show you how far you are from the next station until you're within 1 kilometer. There is a track at the top that shows you roughly how far you've progressed in that leg, but that's not really showing you a whole lot. These issues with speed management and the distance means that it's also hard to maintain a proper schedule. If you drive the speed limit, you're going to arrive way too early, except on legs where you have to drive the speed limit, and when you set out on those legs, it's not clear which is which. The original Pocket Densha would just make you want to cry. This one makes you go, why can't I just be playing Densha de Go instead? Well, the reason you're not playing Densha de Go instead is because Densha de Go wouldn't be released for the Game Boy Color for another 8 months. And the thing is, this isn't even the first version of Densha de Go for a portable system, or the second, or the third. There's already Densha de Go 1 and 2 out for the Wonder Swan, and Densha de Go for the Neo Geo Pocket, but those versions are tough to capture from, and not really that much different from the Game Boy Color version. So I'm sticking to the Game Boy Color. And while I'm not going to make any claim that this version of Densha de Go is a hidden masterpiece that everyone should go out and get, it is an exceptional effort that managed to get way more of the game onto that cartridge than you might expect. They digitized the original's 3D graphics, and then tiled them in a way to give a decent sense of motion to the Game Boy version. You'll notice that stations get a lot more drawings than other terrain, because stations are where you're going to be speeding up and slowing down, and you'll notice the effect the most. All 4 lines from the original game are replicated, and in some cases, it's pretty easy to tell that you're driving the same line. For others, well, they did their best, but there are no rice paddies in Shinagawa. The driving model is fairly similar to classic Densha de Go as well. Very slow to accelerate and very tough to brake. You're going to have to get a feel for how the train stops in order to get some proper control. Also, this is closer to the arcade version than it is to the PlayStation version. You must stop within 1 meter of the goal. In other words, when the distance reads 0. The Game Boy Color version is actually more difficult than the PlayStation version. A new addition here is that completing a leg of a trip gets you a stamp, and collecting these unlocks pictures of trains. Are you going to want to go back and play Densha de Go for the Game Boy Color? Well, no. It's still rough. But it is an amazing Game Boy Color port. They even have the station jingles playing. It's hard to imagine a port to the Game Boy Color that could have been done better. But wait, there's more. Densha de Go 2 for the Game Boy Color followed a year afterwards. And honestly, there's nothing new to say about this one. In terms of look and feel and controls, it's the same as the first one. And it replicates all of the lines that you can drive in the arcade version of Densha de Go 2 with reasonable fidelity. Mainly it's here so I've got something on screen while I talk about a few other portable releases. For whatever reason, the Game Boy Advance didn't get train games, but the PlayStation Portable did. They were just scaled-down versions of PS2 releases that I've already talked about. And after that, there was Densha de Go Tokubetsu-hen Fukatsu Showa no Yamanote-sen, which was a special Nintendo DS release of Densha de Go that was made for the anniversary of the Yamanote line. There's one more option for a portable Densha de Go, but we'll save that for a little bit still. We've been looking at trains for such a long time. Let's take a break and look down some of the family tree that descended from Densha de Go. First up are Taito's efforts to expand the series. Taito made 5 more games in what they called their Go series. And these games are almost entirely focused around the year 2000. Or at least the PlayStation games are. The arcade versions came a little bit earlier. We're going to kick things off with the most successful of them, Jet de Go. And you know what? That cover isn't special enough. I want a cover that shows off that I'm a jet setter, not one of those people who have to walk. Give me a version of the game that can only be purchased if you were on board a Japan Airlines flight. There we go. That's better. Jet de Go started out as an arcade game, but of course I'm playing the version for the original PlayStation. The principle behind it was the same as Densha de Go. Take a simulator for a mode of mass transit, and add more game elements to it. So commercial flight is reduced to takeoff, a course adjustment, and then landing. Naturally, there's a special controller for it. The Jet de Go controller consists of a flight yoke, though it pitches up and down rather than pulling in and out, and an analog throttle. And this time there's a full set of buttons for the PlayStation controller on it, because there's a lot of options in the game. When you start playing, you get your choice of 3 different aircraft to fly, and they're rated beginner, medium, and advanced based on how difficult they are to handle. The prop plane's the easiest, the jumbo jet's the hardest. And then you have a board giving you your option of where to take off from. This includes the time of day and weather. When it's time to land, you're also given a board with options for airports. I have a pretty major problem with Jet to Go, and that's how it isn't a flight sim. And I don't mean that in the sense of you can't just take off and fly around wherever you want to go. I mean Jet to Go's flight model, requirements for passing a scenario, and controls don't match an airplane. Now, I'm not a pilot. I'm just someone who's played dozens of different flight simulators since the 1980s. They're not even one of my favorite genres. But I do know the basics of how airplane controls are supposed to work, and how you're supposed to take off and land. But Jet to Go is so far off from reality, it completely throws me. Turning the flight yoke turns the rudder. I don't want to bog this video down in technical details, but that alone would be enough to break someone who's familiar with how to fly. The other major problem is that you don't control your altitude with the throttle. That means you land nose down, with a Boeing 747 Dreamlifter. Again, I don't want to bog this video down with technical details, especially when an actual pilot could be a lot more accurate about these things, but landing a jumbo jet nose down is a good way to kill everybody. The planes in Jet to Go don't handle, fly, or land like real jets, and yet you're scored on your ability to maintain a flight path, matching the altitude and position, so you can learn to fly the Jet to Go way. It's just the wrong way. There are plenty of unrealistic things about driving a train in the Densha de Go series, but they're unrealistic in a way that simplifies things, to make a technical task more of a video game. With Jet to Go, they took something that's already often made into a video game, and screwed it all up. Jumping ahead to 2002, the PlayStation 2 got Jet to Go 2. They can still use the same controller though, and although it carries over some of the same problems, it does have quite a few improvements. Rather than having you just take off and land, now there's waypoints that you have to fly through, which act to guide you on approach. Basically, it gives you something else to do. And the plane actually banks when you do a hard turn now, though the game still tries to keep the plane as level as possible for you. You also have a lot more control over minor functions. You handle the communications with the tower, for example. You can tell passengers to fasten their seatbelt. And of course you have control over the drink service. This time that wasn't a joke. Jet to Go 2 still doesn't feel quite right as a flight simulator, but it is a lot more complete package than the original game. Definitely more usable. It even has a Densha de Go style penalty point system, where you have miles for your flight, and then when you do things wrong, miles are deducted from you. On the other hand, the game probably needed a little bit more guidance, particularly when doing things like taxiing, which is now your responsibility. You get marks on the side indicating what altitude they want you to fly at for the next location, but you'll have to rely on the crosshair on your HUD for directions, and that doesn't work especially well when you're getting around the airport. Still, if you're going to play a Jet to Go game, this is the one to play. Alright, back to 2000 again, and RC to Go has the weird distinction of being the only one of these Go games to be released outside of Japan. In fact, it was released in the US under the title RC to Go. In fact, I'm playing that US version right now. Once more, this started out as an arcade game, though I have never in my life seen an RC to Go cabinet. No trains or public transportation in this one, well, except the remote-controlled Shinkansen engine that you can get. Instead, you're just driving RC cars, and the game always plays from a fixed perspective, just like you'd get if you were participating in an actual RC car racing event. You can choose between street and off-road driving. There's a few different styles of cars that you can pick from, basically choosing if they focus on acceleration, top speed, grip, or if they just balance all of those. And then you take part in 10 3-lap races. While you drive, you can get a boost by hitting L1 and R1, and while boosted, you can knock other cars out of the way. Naturally, the controls always handle from the perspective of the car, so hitting right will turn right, hitting left will turn left, but your perspective is fixed, so you have to keep in mind the car's rotation. Races go pretty quick, but there's a time limit on every stage that is so severe that even if you're in first place, there's a pretty good chance of running out of time and not completing the race. You practically have to boost continuously to not run out of time. The AI opponents aren't especially sharp here. They mainly exist as road bumps to get in your way, but at least the courses are all pretty nice. The right amount of ramps, sharp turns, and obstacles to keep an RC car event interesting. I gotta say, I appreciate the absurdly over-the-top announcer who sounds like he should be shouting the introductions to a fighting game. As a game, Densha de Go falls flat for me, but I can't really say that it doesn't succeed at what it set out at doing. The last unique entry in Taito's Go series is my personal favorite. Power Shovel ni Noro, or just Power Shovel in the US, or Power Diggers in Europe. It puts you behind the controls of a power shovel, and then says, go ahead, wreck stuff. Once again, it started out as an arcade game, and all it really comes down to is that you play a series of minigames where you are driving the power shovel. Stage 1 in the arcade version is to dig some sand and drop it in a truck. If you can do that, then Stage 2 is to wreck a house, and then if you can pull that one off with the most difficult shovel, then you have to dig a trench to protect a village from an erupting volcano. For the home version, Taito added a ton of additional minigames. Fish sea turtles out of a pool, serve up giant piles of curry, operate a cash register, drive an obstacle course. Basically, anything that they thought that you could use a giant piece of scooping machinery to work with, they made a minigame for it. Naturally, all of the minigames are timed, and the challenge here is in mastering the controls. And that's why they made a special controller for the PlayStation version. This monster controller has 2 joysticks, and on the regular controller the D-pad is the left joystick, while the face buttons are the right joystick. And each of these operate 2 axes of control for the power digger. Left and right on the left stick rotates the whole machine. Left and right on the right-hand stick controls the scoop. So with 4 axes of articulation, you've got potential for some very fine control, but it will take you a while to get used to it. There's 3 different power diggers that you can use, and of course the small one is the easiest, while the big one, well, you have to be very careful as you move around. And that's how this game works. You just play mini-games and have fun. This isn't a game that's going to hold your attention for an especially long time, but it's great to pull out every once in a while and goof off. It's especially fun to introduce to people and watch them scramble as they try to figure out how to pull off some of these tasks. The whole thing is just a ton of fun. Now you might be going, that's 4 games, but you said that there were 5 games in the Go series. Well, this chapter was just for the Go series that didn't have trains. For that final entry, let's move over. The remaining Densha de Go spin-off from Taito in the year 2000 was Densha de Go, or Let's Go by Steam Train. And this one was straight to the PlayStation. There is no arcade version of Densha de Go. Operating a steam engine is considerably more complicated than an electric locomotive. With the electric, you basically turn it on, set how fast you want to go, and that's it. The reality is a bit more complicated than that, but not by much. Densha de Go offers two different control modes, one that works just like Densha de Go, which basically reduces it to an accelerator and a brake, and the other gives you a lot more fine control over how the train behaves. You have control of the valve gearing, the steam intake regulator, and the pneumatic braking system, and you'll have to learn how to adjust them. Most of the meters are backward from what you might expect. The high value on the intake valve, for example, is actually the lowest gear, and the pneumatic braking is off when the pressure gauge reads its highest value. There is a third control option, a two-player mode where the second player is the assistant engineer, stoking the fire and maintaining the pressure in the boiler. Now you might think that since you're driving steam locomotives, that this game would be set well in the past when steam trains were still in regular operation. Well, it's not. One of the lines you drive is even the Keihin Tohoku line, which is one of the standard Densha de Go lines, right through the heart of Tokyo and alongside modern trains. The other two lines that you can drive in Densha de Go are tourist lines, where steam trains still operate. Or at least steam trains still operated on them when the game was developed. The Shinetsu main line was demolished about 10 years ago for a Shinkansen expansion. But the Banetsu West line is still in operation, with steam trains, taking tourists on scenic railways. Something that you might have noticed by this point is that visually, Densha de Go has some real problems. Not that the PlayStation Densha de Go games have been visual powerhouses, but this one looks really rough, and it definitely doesn't help that they introduced screen shake, apparently to try to replicate the steam engine feel, but it just gives me a headache. This is a much more difficult game than the regular Densha de Go, and that's mainly due to how much harder it is to drive that steam train. It'll definitely take you a while to get used to braking. Also, this is one of the Densha de Go games that requires really tight precision when you pull into the station. You have to stop within 1 meter. The lines are fairly long here, and it could be 3 or 4 kilometers between stations. And unlike the later Densha de Go games, they hadn't figured out how to give you other things to do while driving yet. So this is another case of get up to speed and then coast and watch the game for a while. There's a reason that Taito's never gone back to steam trains with the Densha de Go series. Densha de Go just doesn't really work especially well, and you'll be a lot happier sticking with the electric versions. I have to jump back in time a bit here, because Tomy actually beat Taito to driving a steam train in a Densha de Go model. But before I get into SL de Iko, I have to do something. You see, the copy that I purchased for recording this video happened to be a brand new copy, sealed in the package. So I'm breaking open the plastic on a 26-year-old game. That's right, I'm ruining its collector value. Okay, it has 0 collector value because SL de Iko is awful. And I actually played it quite a bit before I got this copy, so I knew when I put down my 900 yen for it that I was getting something truly bad. The first clue that there's something wrong with this game is the title. SL for Steam Locomotive, and de Iko means let's go by. So this game, which is borrowing heavily from Densha de Go, whose title means let's go by train, is let's go by steam locomotive. This is the video game equivalent of one of those mockbusters that Asylum Studios releases. And just as good. I will give SL de Iko this. The driving model's a little bit better than it is in Densha de Go. You've got a bit more fine control, and the response feels more realistic. But everything else here is pretty bad. The biggest single problem is that the shaking picture that I complained about with Densha de Go is here and about 100 times worse. This game burns my eyes. The rest of the graphics aren't doing it any favors either, but that shaking is the worst part of it. Another major problem here is that maintaining enough coal and water to reach the next station is a central gameplay mechanic. There are 5 difficulty levels, each one driving a different section of line, and with those difficulty levels comes varying amounts of coal and water. The game also operates on Densha de Go rules, so you have a certain amount of time to reach the next station, and points that get deducted from every time you make an error. So you have to go fast to reach the next station on time, but just getting up to speed is going to drain your resources a lot. There's no margin of error, even on the lower difficulty levels. You're going to have to learn how to drive this steam train very carefully, and you don't have any guidance for that. There's not even help in the manual. They give you the basic information to operate the locomotive, but not how to drive it efficiently. It takes a lot of practice with this game if you want to make just one single stop. And it's definitely not worth putting that amount of time and effort into getting good enough at this game to be able to make any progress. A year later, and Tomy was at it again with SL de Go 2. And there's a bit of a surprise with this one. It's actually the most playable of the steam train games. It still has a lot of problems, and it's probably not one you'd want to go back to regularly, but it is a lot better than the other two I've shown. The sequel retains the driving model from the original game, so it handles well, just a bit slow. It'll likely take a kilometer for you to get the train up to speed. The default view is pretty awful, but you can change it so that you have a wide open forward view of the tracks. And that stupid camera shake is gone. The visuals aren't the best, but it's a huge improvement. There's still the limitation on coal and water that you have to use to get to the next station, but now on the easier difficulty levels, there's tons of it. And that means plenty of room to fiddle around and figure out what you're doing. The big problem here is that it is a long way between stations. The first stop on this line, for example, was 15 kilometers away. There was an intermediate station that you passed through, but it didn't give you a distance to that one, just a time that you had to reach it. That makes it a little bit hard to plan your speed. On that long trip, the only thing you really do, other than regulate your speed, is blow the whistle whenever you reach a crossing or tunnel. So you can't just walk away because you'll lose too many points if the whistle isn't blown, but it's not really the most engaging gameplay. So SL de Go 2 offers the best driving experience, but not the best gaming experience. Well, you can't have everything. I'm starting to wind down this video on trains, which means now it's a good time to look at games inspired by train games. And even if they're not directly inspired, they share enough features in common that if you like train games, you probably want to give them a try. First up is ArtDink's Kaze no Notam, or the Notice to Airmen of the Wind. Yeah, I'd probably just use the official Notam of Wind rather than that lengthy thing. This is a game where you pilot a hot air balloon. And as a hot air balloon, it has exactly two controls. Go higher or go lower. Rather similar to how trains have go and stop as their controls. A hot air balloon doesn't have any control over its direction. For that, it's totally dependent on the wind. And that's the key gameplay element of Kaze no Notam. 5 indicators on the right-hand side that show you the direction of the wind at different altitudes. So you need to keep your balloon at a certain altitude in order to ride the wind the way you want to go. There are 3 different tasks you're given. Place a marker to maximize the area of a triangle, fly to a point on the map and then place a marker there, or to hit other balloons with markers as you float past them. You have a limited amount of fuel, and of course the balloon is always drifting slowly downward unless you spend some of that fuel to stay high up. You also have to deal with obstructions on every map, like the tall buildings in the city, and every stage has certain prevailing air currents. So you might want to go north, but the wind just doesn't blow that way. That's where the challenge in the game comes from. Figuring out how to navigate the air currents and get where you want to go. sometimes riding them to the very edge of the map, where a poorly timed shift of the wind could blow you out of bounds, forcing you to start over. Kaze no Notom isn't an incredibly difficult game, but it does take some practice to do well at it, especially when it comes to leading your shots at the other balloons. But really, the whole point of this game is to just float above the world, enjoy the scenery, which unfortunately doesn't have great draw distance, and just drift away on your balloon. Going from something peaceful and relaxing to something very high stress now. This is the first game in the Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu series, or to use the English title given on the cover, Art Truck Battle. This is one of those game series that never made it outside of Japan, but has way more entries in it than you might expect. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them. Dekotora, if you're not familiar with the term, are the elaborately decorated semis that you'll sometimes see on Japanese highways. Think Pimp My Semi, and you've got the right idea. The basic concept in Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu is that you drive your truck down highway routes across Japan. There's a story mode, or you can just drive. And you'll encounter various other truck drivers who feel that your ride is insufficiently pimped. And so you'll have to duel them down the highway, racing to your final destination. You might be thinking, okay, it's a weird racing game. How does this relate to trains? And that's where the control scheme for Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu comes in. Because you don't steer the truck. Not fully. You've got the accelerator, the brake, and you can honk the horns or shout out the window. But when it comes to steering, there's 3 lanes on the highway, and you hit left and right to choose what lane you're driving in. Well, first you hit left and right to turn on the turn signal, then the next press will put you into that lane, because you want to be safe as you're engaged in your art truck battles. So the game becomes focused on getting around traffic, blocking your rival, and sometimes bullying your way through when you can't find any other path. Ideally, you catch up to your opponent and then block them in, forcing them to fall way back. Now the whole time you're driving, an enka song is playing, and you have until the end of that song to reach the end of the course. So you're racing not just the other truck, but the singer. At least you have a timer for the song letting you know how long you have to go. When you win a course, you get money, you use that to upgrade your truck, and then repeat. There's tools in the game to build your own custom artwork for your truck, though I think they're awfully difficult to use and not worth engaging with. Just buy one of the regular paint schemes. Similar to some other train games we've seen, this reduces truck driving down to a very simple set of inputs. Go faster, stop, and change lanes. And that's really all you need here. It's not an especially deep game, but it's definitely amusing to race along those roads, smashing cars out of the way. The original publisher of Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu was Human Entertainment, and they only survived about a year after the original game. But the idea was too good to let go, and so it got picked up by Spike and Jalico. This is Shin Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu, or New Art Truck Battle if we want to retain the old naming scheme. This is pretty much as far as the series goes, though there is a Wii release after this. And I thought it'd be nice to check in and see how far the series went from the beginning to the end. And the answer is not very far. Besides the upgraded graphics, the biggest change are indicators telling you what lane you should be in for maximum speed. This is all about taking the turns tightly. But past that, it's pretty much the same game. You could start with a plain truck and then race against people to earn cash and buy new art. Or you could play the story mode where you already have a decked out truck. The controls remain the same, 3 lanes that you steer into, and you have to signal before you turn. And you can blast your horn or shout at people. And of course the Emka music is back. That's actually a major selling point of this entire series. I mean, they put every game's featured singer on the box. Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu is a series that remained remarkably consistent across its 10-year run. so you could feel free to pick up any of them and just dive right in. Here's the game in this block that owes the most to Densha de Go. It is safe to say that the Tokyo Bus Guide series without Taito's guiding example. The series actually started out as a Sega arcade game, Tokyo Bus Tour, and then the home port of that, which was not published by Sega, was Tokyo Bus Anai, and finally the sequel to it is Tokyo Bus Guide 2. That's the version I'm playing here because all three are effectively identical, and this one just happens to look the nicest. And as you might guess at this point, the Tokyo Bus series is Densha de Go on a bus. You select a route that you will drive, all of which are real-world Tokyo bus routes, and then you need to try to maintain a schedule as you drive your bus. You got control over the doors and announcements, and if you don't use those properly, you'll get penalized. There's also penalties for running traffic lights, accelerating or braking too fast, not pulling close enough to the curb at a stop. On the other hand, you get points every time you successfully complete a stop or go past a stop that you don't need to stop at. So even if you fumble with the controls, like I'm doing here because it's been a while since I played, it's not that difficult to recover some points. You start out with 100 points, and if that ever falls to 0, then it's game over. Of course, the quickest way to fall to 0 is to hit anything. That is an instantaneous game over, and probably the cruelest thing in this game, since it's all the way back to the start if that happens. You have to obey all traffic signals, make stops when there are people waiting to be picked up, or if somebody's signaled that they want to get off, and handle the bus in these narrow streets. It's harder than it looks, especially when you get into the residential areas. The biggest problem with the series is the very limited number of routes that you can drive. There's only 3 in each game, plus a training course for challenge modes. At least you can drive the routes in either direction. While it's hardly the most thrilling driving simulator out there, it does hit the same spot of gamifying the precision required by drivers that made Densha de Go so interesting. If you like Densha de Go at all, then the Tokyo Bus series are definitely games that you need to check out. Most of the games I've shown so far have been focused on streamlining the train driving experience, taking the real-world practice and making it more of a video game. Even the Train Simulator series, which were working with better physics models for driving, still had a very narrow, very video game style focus. There is another approach, though. You can just give players control of the vehicle and let them do what they want. One of the pioneering titles in this type of simulator was Microsoft Flight Simulator, which, unlike other flight games at the time, didn't have you shoot down enemies. It just gave you a civilian aircraft and said, hey, go fly. In 2001, Microsoft took that approach and applied it to trains with Microsoft Train Simulator. You might think, oh good, we're finally away from Japanese-developed games, so we'll get some train lines in other parts of the world. Well, joke's on you. Not only does Microsoft Train Simulator contain Japanese train lines, there are train lines that I've already shown off in this video. Though actually, I'm driving a freight train in Montana for this footage. We'll get more pictures of Japanese rail lines soon enough. Microsoft Train Simulator offers 6 different rail lines, 2 in Japan, 2 in North America, 2 in Europe. Although it also had one of the major features that we're going to see with all train simulators, a ton of extra content that you could buy. How much extra content? Well, let me put it this way. The number of different packages that you could purchase for German content are numbered up to 34, and that's just Germany. There's around 100 commercially released things you could go out and buy in a store, add-ons for Microsoft Train Simulator that would provide you with different routes, different trains, and in one case the ability to paint trains any way you like. The modding scene for Microsoft Train Simulator was enormous as well, so you could always go online and just download more of this. It might sound a little bit weird to say, but Microsoft Train Simulator was a really big deal. I'm just sticking to the base package though. Microsoft Train Simulator offers electric, diesel, and steam locomotives to drive, each with their own set of controls. This is one of those games where you have to have a map of your keyboard sitting in front of you while you play, so you know what you have to press in order to do things. Don't expect a logical mapping of the keys either. At least in the cockpit view, you can directly interact with the controls on the panel, but you're still going to need to use the keyboard for a lot of in-game functions, like bringing up the timetable. This is a game with a pretty robust physics model. You can tear the train apart if you try to drive off too fast, for example. And I think this is the first game I've been showing that really lets you crash a train. Besides just driving the line, like I'm doing here, each line also has about 10 scenarios that provide different conditions, tasks that you have to perform, and disasters to overcome. I'm driving steep gradients in sunny weather right here, but I could drive these same tracks in a blizzard, trying to stop the train safely before I run into something. Or on the Alpine line, there's a scenario where there's been a murder on the Orient Express, and a world-famous Belgian detective who happens to be on board wants you to do certain things with the train to help his investigation. Microsoft Train Simulator was complicated, extremely detailed, and infinitely expandable. So where do they take it from here? And the answer to that is nowhere. Microsoft Train Simulator was born from a different Microsoft game studio than the one that emerged with the birth of the Xbox. And Microsoft pulled a Microsoft and basically killed everything that wasn't their new thing. However, thanks to a large modding community, Microsoft Train Simulator didn't really die. Instead, an open source version called OpenRails was created. And it both expands the capabilities of the original Microsoft Train Simulator, as well as allows for a lot more modifications. I'm playing one of those fan-made lines here, a rail line connecting Edinburgh and Glasgow. OpenRails gives you widescreen support, as well as higher resolutions, but it also introduces a lot of the problems that are common with open source software. If you actually want to use it, you're going to have to do a lot of legwork. You'll be looking through old message board posts and defunct websites, trying to find answers to basic problems. The interface is truly awful, and there will be problems that you just have to live with because nobody's gotten around to fixing them in a decade. OpenRails is interesting that it exists, but I also think that the Train Simulator fanbase has moved on from the Microsoft Train Simulator model. It's there if you just absolutely want to try something, but you're probably better off with a commercial package. And for those commercial packages, well, Microsoft Train Simulator opened the floodgates, and now there's more of them than you could shake a stick at. I'm starting with Dovetail Games' Train Simulator, because it's essentially the successor to Microsoft Train Simulator. The series came from people who worked on the original game, and at least in the original versions, it stuck pretty close to that formula. These days the series is split between Train Simulator Classic, which just has you drive trains, and Train Sim World that gives you a bit more control of the environment and lets you walk around in it. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. One thing that the train simulators have in common at this point is that they are kind of lifestyle games. Basically, they're games designed for train simulation enthusiasts who only want to play train simulators. Which, hey, more power to you. But for someone who wants to just dip their toe in, you're going to find that the base games don't have a lot to do, and instead, everything is spread out among downloadable content. In fact, all of these games are kind of infamous for the sheer quantity of downloadable content they have. Different engines, different routes, all of them costing as much as a whole other game. No one's expected to pay the $1,000 to get all of the DLC, but they are anticipating their fans buying another $40 map especially if it includes their personal favorite train line. However, another common thing among these train simulator games is the extreme support of the modding community. They include tools in the game to help you design your own stuff, and there's literally tens of thousands of downloads out there for you. In terms of gameplay, in Train Simulator Classic you always pick a scenario and then have to play it out. You're scored based on how well you drive the train, how appropriately you obey signals. In a sense, it's similar to games like Densha de Go, but you never get a game over. You just keep playing it out until the scenario's over and you get a final score for how well you did. Naturally, most aspects of driving the train are directly under your control. And I say most because we're going to get into some really obsessive detail in a minute. The whole thing works well enough, though as a simulator, it's going to be a lot of driving with a lot of quiet time as you watch the scenery roll past. Remember, they're going for realism here, and there's a lot of empty space between stations. Train Simulator Classic delivers exactly what you'd expect from a train simulator. If you're the kind of person who just wants to drive trains, then you're going to find what you want here. Other people will probably bounce off. Now I'm moving over to Train Simulator Classic's big brother, Train Sim World, specifically Train Sim World 4. Although, based on the progress I'm making, this video might get released almost simultaneously with the release of Train Sim World 5. Finally, scheduling works in my favor. One of the most significant things in Train Sim World is that you are not trapped in the train. You can get up, walk around, go explore, find hidden objects and scenarios, and most importantly here, interact with every single system on the train. All of those weird buttons and switches, you can flip them. Want to play around in the fuse box? You can do that. You want to see what happens when you tinker with the generator? Sure, feel free. If you could do it on the real locomotive, then you can do it on the locomotive in Train Sim World. This is another game that's scenario-based, and even the introductory scenarios are huge. I'm playing the introductory one for a Los Angeles line here. See the LA River off to the right? This scenario takes over an hour to play out. On the other hand, even though you have about 30 hours of scenarios in the base game, once again, if you want to drive anything other than the handful of lines included, you're going to be spending a lot of money. On the positive side of that, so far, Train Sim World versions have been backwards compatible. So I have scenarios that I purchased for Train Sim World 2 that I can load up in Train Sim World 4. The big thing about the Train Sim World series is verisimilitude. The trains are modeled down to tiny details, and the world itself is uncannily accurate. Okay, you won't find the latest chain store off to the side of the road, but if you know the area that you're driving through, it's all extremely recognizable. That makes Train Sim World the big series for train simulations. There are other simulators that are trying to come at it, but this is the one with momentum and popularity. Trains is not the most realistic game here. In fact, I was kind of hesitant to put it in this simulator section, except it's got a few things that it shares in common with other simulator games. The first Trains game was actually a contemporary of Microsoft Train Simulator back in 2001, and there's been almost a dozen versions of it since then. I'm playing the 2019 version here, though the 2022 is the most recent. The reason why I wouldn't jump on Trains as a simulator is that it winds up working out more as a model train set than a simulator. You can drive trains and do scenarios. In fact, I'm doing one here. The game is really built around giving you all the tools to build your own environment for the trains. Want to build the train yard in your town? Well, here you go. And naturally, there's thousands of dollars in DLC that you can purchase that adds more models, areas to drive in, and of course a few scenarios. As a game, Trains is also pretty user hostile. Driving is freely blended with editing, which again tells you what the real focus of the series is. You can even put the train or certain other vehicles into an automatic drive mode and just watch the scenario play out. Trains might be a long-running series, but it's not the one that I would jump on if I wanted to drive my train. As I bring this video in for a conclusion, I need to look at train games now, or now-ish. The simulators carried the train game torch for a while, but we're living in an era of genre mashups and revivals. There's more happening with train games now than there has been since the late 90s. I'm starting with Trans-Siberian Railway Simulator, a game that's in early access at the time of this recording, and smashes together a whole bunch of games. The concept here is that as an engineer on the Trans-Siberian Railway, you have to deal with rundown Soviet-era trains, driving them through brutally harsh conditions in some of the most remote places on Earth. You have to keep yourself alive, hopefully earning enough as you drive that you can afford the supplies to keep you going, and while you're dealing with all of that, you've got the mafia breathing down your neck, making demands of you. You're lucky if the overly complex hardware works half the time, and you have to do all of the maintenance yourself, manually swapping in and out parts as necessary. So this slams together train sim world, some mechanic games, a bit of first-person shooting, and of course survival. Now you might notice two things in my footage here. First, I'm not driving the train. That's because I think the interesting features in Trans-Siberian Railway Simulator are the ones before you drive, and I am using the tutorial. And that's because I have no chance of remembering half this stuff even after I've played it. Starting the train is an arduous process that takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and you'll have to run back and forth between different compartments of the train, manually fiddling with controls that are always placed in the least convenient way. I'm not sure how much of a simulator it actually is, but it definitely feels like an engine that would have been built by the Soviet Union in the 1960s. As I mentioned, Trans-Siberian Railway Simulator is still in early access, though this is also the kind of game where I'm not expecting much in the way of mechanical improvements from this point on. They're not going to make this game easier to use. This is one where the complexity, harshness, and unfairness is the point. This is a distinctive take on the train game, and it's fairly different from anything else. If anyone has kept the spirit of the classic train game alive, it's Sonic-powered. As a company, they were doing lightweight games for a few years before they stumbled into their true calling, the Tetsudou-Nippon series. These games started out on the 3DS in 2013, and you're not seeing those versions because I don't have a great way to capture from my 3DS. They made 5 of these games for the 3DS, and they were eventually released overseas as Japanese Rail Sim 3D. As the 3DS started winding down, Sonic-powered transitioned the series to other platforms like the Switch and PS4. Some of these games are basically remakes of the 3DS games, but there's some original ones as well. Each release contains just one train line, and the most recent release in the Tetsudou-Nippon series came out, let me check a calendar, tomorrow. Well, that's assuming you're watching this video as soon as it goes up. Conveniently, a lot of Sonic-powered games have been released internationally, but even if you get the Japanese versions, you get the English version with it. In fact, right here I'm playing my Japanese copy of Tetsudou-Nippon Rosentabi Eizan Densha-hen, which in the US is available as Japanese Rail Sim Journey to Kyoto. As you might have already noticed at this point, this game uses video footage similar to the Train Simulator series. The original Train Simulator series, not the one I just talked about a few minutes ago. And it works a lot like that one, speeding up and slowing down the footage to make it match the speed of your driving. This also carries a lot of the weight of Densha de Go. Your goal on every leg is to arrive on time plus or minus 3 seconds, and stop within 50 centimeters of the mark at the station. You get rated by how close to those goals you are, and you get penalties when you do things like speed too much or keep honking the horn. At the end of every segment, you're given a grade, so there isn't a continuous flow of video in these games, but that probably helps make it match your driving a little bit better. You only have access to a portion of the line to start out with, and as you earn decent grades driving those lines, you'll unlock more and more. That's why you always have the option of replaying any station-to-station segment that you choose. And even though this is one line, at least this release does have 5 different versions of it. There's a fork off of the line that you follow, so there's 2 versions there, and then you can take both of those up or down, which means they had to record in both directions. And then there's another trip on the line that was recorded in a completely different time of the year. The footage for most of the game was recorded in autumn. As you get up into the mountains, you get some pretty good view of the fall foliage, but that alternative drive was recorded during the summer. There are a lot of Tetsudou Nippon games, but they're all so similar I'm not going to bother demonstrating them. It's just video playback, so the Switch version looks pretty close to this. The Tetsudou Nippon series, or Japanese Rail Sim series, is a lot closer to the train simulator games than Densha de Go, but I think fans of either of those would be pretty satisfied with them. And speaking of the original train simulator series, as of 2022, they are back. Though since their trademark got sniped, they're now calling it JR East Train Simulator. These are strictly PC games, or game in this case, but it sticks to the standard train simulator formula. Pre-recorded footage, accurate driving model, and not really pushing things toward gamifying it. And just like its train simulator successors, Gatan has been releasing DLC rather than individual games. So there's 18 different lines that you can drive, each of which are DLC that cost as much as the original game, which only has 1 line. If you don't want that first game's line and want one of the DLC lines, tough. I should confess here that I've been using their promo footage rather than recording my own for this segment. I would have just skipped over this one since I couldn't record it, but I felt Train Simulator coming back was a bit important for this video. Okay, I lied. One more Sonic-powered game, but I'm making this really quick. This is Tetsudou Nippon Real Pro Tokyu Soko Nagoya Tetsudou-hen, or Japanese Railways Real Pro Limited Express Nagoya Railroad. The Real Pro games are the backside of Sonic-powered series, and none of those have been released outside of Japan. So that's why there's no English version on this one. I'm playing the Switch version, because the Switch is the lead version of these games for some reason. And most of what you're going to see is pretty much identical to the other Tetsudou Nippon games. But there's 2 things in the Real Pro series, besides the lack of English, that stand out. The first, and most obvious while I'm driving, is the inclusion of a guide for how you should drive. You don't have to have this on, but it's one of the big features of the game. The red line is the speed limit. The dim, dark green line is how a professional driver handled this, and the bright green line is how you're doing. The other major change is how you're scored when you pull into the station. Rather than just a handful of points, the Real Pro series scores you on a much finer gradient. You'll get a score where 100 is pretty good, though you still get a letter grade that's similar to the previous game, and those grades get you medals which are used to unlock additional bits of line, special challenge modes, or pictures of the trains. There's some neat features here, and I kind of wish they weren't limited to the Japanese releases, and that they had it with a more scenic railway than Nagoya. Nagoya's not the prettiest city in Japan. So, while I had most of the games featured in this video already, I did purchase a few thinking, oh, that might be something I can use. And that would include Train Life, a railway simulator. I was thinking, okay, another railway simulator will help shore up that section of the video where I'm the weakest, but I need to play through it a bit so that I have a feel for it before I record anything. And then I discovered the horrible truth. Despite what it says on the cover, Train Life is not a railway simulator. That is a filthy, filthy lie. The trains don't have realistic controls, they don't handle realistically, you don't even drive through realistic environments. If you play some other popular games with simulator in the title, Train Life is going to be very familiar. It is essentially Euro Truck Simulator 2 with trains. You're the owner of a train company, but you also have to drive your train around a very scaled down map of Europe, take contracts to pick up loads from various locations, and then get paid when you drop them off. You have control over the rail switches that you find on the way, and that's how you pick your path around areas. As you earn money, you buy better trains, eventually you'll need to hire other drivers for your company, and basically you just build up money over time. This is pretty far from a realistic depiction of a railroad freight company. All of the lines are public use, and every place that you can stop has a train maintenance barn that you pull into for repairs, refueling, and purchasing whatever you need. The biggest dangers to you as you drive will be that you get fined for speeding, or that you'll run a signal onto a section of track where there's already a train. Train Life isn't a simulator, and it's definitely not a Densha de Go like, but I thought it was a fun spin on train driving. The biggest issues I had with it was that it spent a lot of time copying systems that were designed for truck driving, and when you're on rails, these slow you way down. You'll have to drive half a kilometer to get to a switch, and then flip it to go back the other way again if you wound up on the wrong track, for example. And it's not like you're dealing with constant traffic. You might see 1 or 2 trains during a trip. Still, I found Train Life to be kind of a fun spin on the formula. And finally it's time. The Return of the King. Okay, the King returned in 2017 and hasn't done anything since, but still. Densha de Go surprised everyone with a new arcade version for the 20th anniversary of the series. And that version made its way to home consoles. And naturally, it was complete with a whole new train controller just for it. And of course, I'm going full circle and driving the Yamanote line again. The official title of this home release is Densha de Go Hashiro Yamanote-sen, or Drive the Yamanote line, which kind of tells you the focus of this one. The full loop of the Tokyo encircling train line is included here, as well as the Chuuou line that cuts across it. There's a few other lines, but they're kind of cheats because they're lines that run on the same circuit as the Yamanote line. They just have different trains and use different stops. So what did Taito, and I guess Square Enix since they now own Taito, bring when they revived Densha de Go? Well, in this release, there's a mission mode and an arcade mode. In the arcade mode, you've got your pick of lines to drive and segments that you can use. And then you get scored based on how effective you were on those segments. In mission mode, you have to drive a whole series of those segments, and if you do well, then you unlock the next mission. Basically, it's constraining you to a small section of the game, slowly unlocking more and more as you go. There's also a daily random challenge, where anyone who plays on that day gets served up the same particular task. The scoring system has been revamped, and it's a lot like the one used in the Sonic-powered games. Based on how you did when you complete a leg, you're graded between D and S, and stopping precisely as well as being on time are the major components of that score. The game is also a lot more aggressive about you needing to use your horn when you approach bridges, and using your light to signal passing trains. This version of Densha de Go includes some arcade-level difficulty. The timetable is super tight, and once you fall behind, you're not making it up. If you want to do well, you really do need to scream into the station at full speed, and then brake way later than you think. As you progress through missions, or if you select a higher difficulty stage on arcade mode, you'll find other features as you drive, such as segments where it wants you to maintain a precise speed for a period of time, or points where you need to pass at an exact time. These are very similar to Densha de Go Final. While this game feels a bit tighter since it's completely confined to Tokyo, there's more than enough to do. The full Yamanote line is enormous, so it can keep you busy for quite a while. All in all, this is a great revival of Densha de Go. The kind of thing that fans of the series would have been waiting for. I just hope that they keep it going. Though at this point it has been long enough that it's a little concerning. And so my trip through the genre of train games is pulling into the station. And I've shown you about 50 games. Not all of them were train games, and sometimes I stretched the definition a bit, but there were a lot of interesting ones. I hope you found something while watching this video that you want to try out. Games are made to be played after all, and you should experience them, not just watch a video where someone talks about them. Which ones do I think you should play? Well, Densha de Go Final is the best of the classic Densha de Go series, but the recent reboot might be a little bit more accessible for people. Similarly, it's pretty easy to purchase the Sonic-powered games right now. The portable games are interesting curiosities, but you really don't need to play any of them. The Tetsu-One games are a hoot, even though they're not especially deep. For the related games, Taito's Power Shovel is a lot of fun, and the Tokyo Bus Guide series are a great spin on the Densha de Go concept. Finally, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of driving a train, and you want to bury yourself for months, then you really can't go wrong with Train Sim World. I don't have a physical copy of that one. I bought it on Steam. Now if you think that after around 50 games, I've missed something, or if there's a train game that you really love that I didn't mention, then tell me about it. Seriously, I'm aware of other train games, but my budget only goes so far. It's not like this video's monetized or I have a Patreon. I don't get paid for this, but I just like talking about cool games. My point is, I couldn't get everything, even though I'm aware that there's more out there. So if you really feel that Train Simulator JR Shikoku 1 is a breakout title that I shouldn't have skimmed over with the rest of the Train Simulator line, then tell me about it. I am genuinely interested. Obviously, my interest is in old games and the history behind them, so recent things tend to be a bit of a blind spot for me. If there's some up-and-coming train simulator that everybody has to have, well, I'm not plugged in enough to know it. But I can tell you about every single Densha de Go release. Before I end this video, I do need to point out the chapter break music. All of them came from this CD, which is a disc of station jingles. Short tunes that play so that you can audibly know what station you're at and where the train that you're looking at is going. And of course, most of the tunes you've heard are from the Yamanote line. Yeah, it's really inescapable. If for some bizarre reason you want a copy of the CD, it only cost me about $10. Thank you for watching the video to the end, and I'll leave you with one final thought.